shy of late. If she was thinking of ending the alliance. Althor has been seen in 5 cities, including that cursed place in the waste, and a dozen towns since those blind fools, those idiots, failed in Kyrie. And that only includes the reports we have. The Great Lord only knows what else is crawling toward us by horse or sheep or whatever else these savages can find to carry a message. Grendel had chosen the setting, since she had been first to arrive, and it irritated him. View walls made the striped wooden floor appear to be surrounded by a forest full of brightly flowered vines and fluttering birds that were even more colorful. Sweet scents and soft bird calls filled the air. Only the arch of the doorway spoiled the illusion. Why did she want a reminder of what was lost? They could as soon make shock lances or show wings as a view wall outside of this place, close to Shale Ghul. In any case, she despised anything to do with nature, as he recalled. Osangar frowned at idiots and blind fools, as well he might, but he quickly smoothed that plain, creased face, so unlike the one he had been born with.
Hey, Christopher, how you doing?
He had always known who he
Hope you're doing well, bro.
Not. A matter of chance, he said calmly, though he did begin dry washing his hands.
Give me 1 second. I got something to show you.
He was garbed
Let me
like
share
some
this
ruler
out
of
real
his
quick.
age, in a coat so heavy with golden embroidery that it almost hid the red of the cloth, and boots fringed with golden tassels. There was enough white lace at his neck and wrists to clothe a child. The man had never known the meaning of excess. If not for his particular skills, he never would have been chosen. Realizing what his hands were doing, Osangar snatched the tall Quaindiar wine glass from the round table beside his chair and inhaled the dark wine's aroma deeply. Simply probabilities, he murmured, trying to sound offhand. Next time, he will be given, taken.
Let me just do a little movie real quick.
You are going to depend on chance. Arengar was stretched out in a long, flowing chair, as though it were a bed chair. Directing a smoky smile at Osangar, she arched one leg on bare toes, so the slit in her bright red skirts exposed her to the very breath threatened freer from the red satin that just contained her full breasts. All of her mannerisms had changed since she became a woman, but not the core of what had been placed into that female body. Demandred hardly scored fleshly pleasures. One day her...
Hey, cheers, Christopher. But this one we're going to show you.
Not that he would mourn, of course, if the next time was final. You were responsible for watching him, Osangar, she went on, her voice caressing every syllable. You and...
Then I got...
Osangar flinched, flicking his tongue against his lips. She laughed throatily. My own charge is... She pressed a thumb down on the edge of the chair as if pinning something, and laughed again. I should think you would be more worried, Arengar, Grendel murmured over her wine. She concealed her contempt about as well as the almost...
How you doing, Christopher?
Of her streaked gown concealed her right curves. You and Osangar and Demandred and Moradin, wherever he is. Perhaps you should fear Althor's success as much as his failure. Laughing, Arengar caught the standing woman's hand in one of hers. Her green eyes sparkled. Perhaps you could explain what you mean better, if we were alone.
I got some deer antlers. I should put these back.
Jerking her hand free with a coarse oath, she stalked away from the chair. Arengar giggled. What do you mean? Osangar said sharply, struggling out of his chair. Once on his feet, he struck a lecturer's pose, gripping his lapels, and his tone became pedantic. In the first place, my dear Grendel, I doubt that even I could devise a method to remove the Great Lord's shadow from Kaedin. Althor is a primitive. Anything he tries inevitably will prove insufficient, and I, for one, cannot believe he can even imagine how to begin. In any event, we will stop him trying because the Great Lord commands it. I can understand fear of the Great Lord's displeasure if we somehow failed, unlikely as that might be. But why should those of us you named have any special fear? Blind as ever, and dry as ever, Brendel murmured. With the return of composure, her gown was...
How's your evening or day going, Christopher?
Perhaps she was not so calm as she pretended. Or perhaps she wanted them to believe she was controlling some agitation. Except for this wreath, her adornments all came from this age. Fire drops in her golden hair, a large ruby dangling between her breasts, ornate golden bracelets on
I'm
both
probably going to
wrists,
use
and something
one of them
strange.
for
Demandred wondered whether
to put a
anyone
new
else
handle on the knife, so I have that
a simple ring
that
of
back
gold
end look
on the
to the
little finger
antler,
of her left hand.
like you
Simple
see on some of
was
those
not
old
associated
school
with
buck
Brendel.
knives or bowie knives that has that
If the young
that
man
antler on it, or the
does
end of it.
somehow remove the shadow, you who channel Sayadin will no longer need the Great Lord's special protection. Will he trust your loyalty then? Smiling, she sipped her wine. Osengar did not smile. His face paled, and he scrubbed a hand across his mouth. Arengar sat up on the edge of her long chair, no longer trying to be sensuous. Her hands formed claws on her lap, and she glared at Grendel as if ready to go for her throat. Demandred's fists unclenched. It was out in the open at last. He had hoped to have Althor dead, or failing that, captive, before this suspicion reared its head. During the War of Power, more than a dozen of the Chosen had died of the Great Lord's suspicion. The Great Lord is sure you are all faithful, Moradin announced, striding in as though he were the Great Lord of the Dark himself. He had often seemed to believe he was, and the boy's face he wore now had not changed that. In spite of his words, that face was grim, and his unrelieved black made his name, Death, fit. You need not worry until he stops being sure. The girl, Sindane, trotted at his heels like a bosomy little silver-haired pet in red and black. For some reason, Moradin had a rat riding his shoulder, pale nose sniffing the air, black eyes studying the room warily. Or for no reason, perhaps. A youthful
That
grace
and
did not make him any saner.
a knife handle to my a friend of mine sent me
called us here.
some video on
I have much to do.
how to
no
turn
time for idle talk.
one
Consciously,
those
he tried
sheds
stand
to
tall,
a nice pipe. So I might looking at that, and well, he sent me a couple links to videos on how to do it. So
A pity. She should hear what I have to say.
I might have to watch those
Showing by
videos
its
and
tail, he watched the animal wave its legs.
see how to go about doing
Nothing
that.
except the rat seemed to exist for him. Small, apparently unimportant matters can become very important, Bernard. This rat, whether Isam succeeds in finding and killing that other vermin, Fane. A word whispered in the wrong ear or not spoken to the right. A butterfly stirs its wings on a branch, and on the other side of the world a mountain collapses. Suddenly the rat twisted, trying to sink its teeth into his wrist. Casually, he flung the creature away. In midair, there was a burst of flame. Something hotter than flame. The rat was gone. Moradin smiled. Demandred flinched.
So I got
as
a
always.
couple knives that
That had been the true power.
I wouldn't mind doing that too.
A black speck.
I got a
blurred across
K
Moradin's
bar
blue eyes,
that I want
laying
to
there in a steady stream.
put that handle
The
on.
man must have been using the true power exclusively since he last saw him to gain so many saw so quickly. He himself had never touched the true power except in need. Great need.
I'll show you one tonight.
Of course, only Moradin had that privilege now, since his... The man truly was insane to use it so freely. A drug more addictive than society, more deadly than poison.
I'm gonna do it,
Crossing the
but
striped floor,
that means I'm gonna have to
Moradin laid a
get a
hand
whole
on
nother
Osengar's
sheath
shoulder.
for it.
His smile made more ominous by the saw. The shorter man swallowed, and gave a wavering smile in return. It is well you've never considered how to remove the Great Lord's shadow.
But that still keep the guard on it, and instead of this, I like this handle, but I rather have that
is not as wise as
that shed for a handle.
Tell them, Sindain. The little woman drew herself up. By face and form, she was a luscious plum, ready for plucking, but her big blue eyes were glacial. A peach, perhaps. Peaches were poisonous here and now. You recall the Choden call, I suppose. No amount of effort could make that low, breathy voice anything except sultry, but she managed to inject sarcasm. Lews Therin has 2 of the access keys, 1 for each. And he knows a woman strong enough to use the female of the pair. He plans to use the Choden card for his deed. Nearly everyone began to talk at once. I thought the keys were all destroyed, Arengar exclaimed, surging to her feet. Her eyes were wide with fear. He could shatter the world just trying to use the Choden card. If you had ever read anything besides a history book, you would know they're almost impossible to destroy, Osengar snarled at her. But he was tugging at his collar, as if it were too tight, and his eyes seemed ready to fall out of his face. How can this girl know he has them? How? Grendel's wineglass had dropped from her hand as soon as the words were out of Sindain's mouth, bouncing end over end across the floor. Her gown turned as crimson as fresh blood, and her mouth twisted as if she were going to vomit. And you've just been hoping to blunder into him, she screamed at Demandred. Hoping someone will find him for you. Fool! Fool! Demandred thought Grendel had been a touch flamboyant even for her. He would wager the announcement had been no surprise to her. It seemed she bore watching. He said nothing. Putting a hand over his heart, for all the world like a lover, Moradin tilted up Sindain's chin on his fingertips. Resentment burned in her eyes, but her face might have been a doll's unchanging face. She certainly accepted his attentions like a pliable doll. Sindain knows many things, Moradin said softly. And she tells me everything she knows. Everything. The tiny woman's expression never altered, but she trembled visibly. She was a puzzle to Demandred. At first, he had thought she was Lanfear reincarnated. Bodies for transmigration supposedly were chosen by what was available, yet Osengar and Arengar were proof of the Great Lord's cruel sense of humor. He had been sure until Masana told him the girl was weaker than Lanfear. Masana and the rest thought she was of this age, yet she spoke of Althor as Lews Therin, just as Lanfear had, and spoke of the Choan Kal as one familiar with the terror they had inspired during the War of Power. Only Balefire had been more feared, and only just. Or had Moradin taught her for purposes of his own, if he had any real purposes? There had always been times when the man's actions had been sheer madness. So it seems he must be killed after all, Demandred said. Hiding his satisfaction was not easy. Randall Thor, or Lews Therin Telamon, he would rest easier when the fellow was dead. Before he can destroy the world, and us. Which makes finding him all the more urgent. Kill? Moradin moved his hands as though weighing something. If it comes to that, yes, he said finally. But finding him is no problem. When he touches the Chodan Kal, you will know where he is. And you will go there and take him. Or kill him, if necessary. The Nameless has spoken. As the Nameless commands, Sindain said eagerly, bowing her head, and echoes of her ran around the room, though Arengar sounded sullen, Osengar desperate, and Grendel oddly thoughtful. Bending his neck hurt Demandred as much as speaking those words. So they would take Althor, while he was trying to use the Chodan Kal, no less. He and some woman drinking enough of the one power to melt continents. But there had been no indication that Morden would be with them, or his twin pets, Mogadin and Sindane. The man was needless for now, but perhaps matters could be arranged so he did not get another body the next time he died. Perhaps it could be arranged soon.
Chapter 14. What a veil hides. The Victory of Kidron rolled on long sea swells, making the gilded lamps in the stern cabin swing on their gimbals, but Tuon sat calmly as the razor in Selucia's sure hand slid across her scalp. Through the tall stern windows she could see other great ships crashing through the gray-green swells in sprays of white, hundreds of them, row on row, stretching to the horizon. 4 times as many had been left at Tanchico. The Friagel, those who come home. The Koren, the return, had begun. A soaring albatross seemed to be following the Kidron, an omen of victory indeed, though the bird's long wings were black instead of white. It must still mean the same thing. Omens did not change according to location. An owl calling at dawn meant death, and rain without clouds an unexpected visitor, in Farah or Norman. The morning ritual was soothing, and she needed that today. Last night she had given a command in anger. No command should be issued in anger. She felt almost Sai-Musif, as if she had lost honor. Her balance was disturbed, and that boded as ill for the return as a loss of Saiter, albatross or no albatross. Selucia wiped away the last of the leather with a warm, damp cloth, then used a dry cloth, and finally powdered her smooth scalp lightly with a brush. When her dresser stepped back, Tuon rose and let her elaborately embroidered blue silk dressing gown slide to the gold and blue patterned carpet. Instantly the cool air pebbled her dark, bare skin. 4 of her 10 maids rose gracefully from where they had been kneeling against the walls, clean-limbed and comely in their filmy white robes. All had been purchased for their appearance as much as their skills, and they were very skilled. They had become used to the motions of the ship during the long voyage from Shon-Chen, and they scurried to fetch the garments that had already been laid out atop the carved chests and bring them to Selucia. Selucia never allowed the Dako veil to actually dress her, not so much as stockings or slippers. When she settled a pleated gown the color of well-aged ivory over Tuon's head, the younger woman could not help comparing the two of them in the tall mirror fastened to the inner wall. Golden-haired Selucia possessed a stately, cream-skinned beauty and cool blue eyes. Anyone might have taken her for one of the blood, and of high rank, rather than a Sojin, if the left side of her head had not been shaved. A notion that would have shocked the woman to the quick, expressed aloud. The very idea of any stepping above her appointed station horrified Selucia. Tuon knew she herself would never have such a commanding presence. Her eyes were too large, and a liquid brown. When she forgot to keep a stern mask, her heart-shaped face belonged on a mischievous child. The top of her head barely came to Selucia's eyes, and her dresser was not a tall woman. Tuon could ride with the best. She excelled at wrestling and the use of suitable weapons, but she had always had to exercise her mind to impress. She had trained that tool as hard as she had trained at every other talent combined. At least the wide woven belt of gold emphasized her waist enough that she would not be taken for a boy in a dress. Men watched when Selucia passed by, and Tuon had overheard some murmur about her full breasts. Perhaps that had nothing to do with a commanding presence, but it would have been nice to possess a little more bosom. "The light be upon me," Selucia murmured, sounding amused, as the Dako veil hurried back to kneel upright against the walls. "You've done that every morning since the first day your head was shaved. Do you still think after 3 years that I'll leave a patch of stubble?" Tuon realized that she had rubbed a hand across her bare scalp. Searching for stubble, she admitted to herself ruefully. "If you did," she said with mock severity, "I would have you beaten. A repayment for all the times you used a switch on me." Placing a rope of rubies around Tuon's neck, Selucia laughed. If you pay me back for all that, I'll never be able to sit down again. Tuon smiled. Selucia's mother had given her to Tuon for a cradle gift, to be her nursemaid, and more important, her shadow, a bodyguard no one knew about. The first 25 years of Selucia's life had been training for those jobs, training in secret for the second. On Tuon's 16th naming day, when her head was first shaved, she had made the traditional gifts of her house to Selucia, a small estate for the care she had shown, a pardon for the chastisements she had given, a sack of 100 golden thrones for each time she had needed to punish her charge. The blood assembled to watch her presented as an adult for the first time had been impressed by all those sacks of coin, more than many of them could have laid hand on themselves. She had been unruly as a child, not to mention headstrong. And the last traditional gift, the offer for Selucia to choose where she would be appointed next. Tuon was not sure whether she or the watching crowd had been more astonished when the dignified woman turned her back on power and authority and asked instead to be Tuon's dresser, her chief maid, and her shadow still, of course, though that was not made public. She herself had been delighted. Perhaps in small doses, spread over 16 years, she said. Catching sight of herself in the mirror, she held her smile long enough to make sure there was no sting in her words, then replaced it with sternness. She certainly felt more affection for the woman who had raised her than for the mother she had seen only twice a year before becoming an adult, or the brothers and sisters she had been taught from her first steps to battle for their mother's favor. 2 of them had died in those struggles so far, and 3 had tried to kill her. A sister and a brother had been made Daco Vale and had their names stricken from the records as firmly as if it had been discovered they could channel. Her place was far from secure even now. A single misstep could see her dead, or worse, stripped and sold on the public block. Blessings of the light. When she smiled, she still looked 16, at best. Chuckling, Selucia turned to take the close-fitting cap of golden lace from its red-lacquered stand on the dressing table. The sparse lace would expose most of her shaven scalp and mark her with the raven and roses. Perhaps she was not Sai Mosief, but for the sake of the Koren, she had to restore her balance. She could ask Anath, or Sopheia, to administer a penance, but it was less than 2 years since Neferi's unexpected death, and she still was not entirely comfortable with her replacement. Something told her she must do this on her own. Perhaps she had seen an omen she had not recognized consciously. Ants were not likely on a ship, but several sorts of beetle might be. No, Selucia, she said quietly. A veil. Selucia's mouth tightened in disapproval, but she replaced the cap on its stand silently. In private, as now, she had license to free her tongue, yet she knew what could be spoken and what not. Tuon had only ever had to have her punished twice, and Light's truth she had regretted it as much as Selucia. Wordlessly, her dresser produced the long, sheer veil, draping it over Tuon's head and securing it with a narrow band of golden braid set with rubies. Even more transparent than the Daco Vale's robes, the veil did not hide her face at all, but it hid what was most important. Laying a long, gold-embroidered blue cape on Tuon's shoulders, Selucia stepped back and bowed deeply, the end of her golden braid touching the carpet. The kneeling Daco Vale bowed their faces to the deck. Privacy was about to end. Tuon left the cabin alone. In the second cabin stood 6 of her Sul'dam, 3 to either side, with their charges kneeling in front
Hey,
of
Mix,
the
how you doing,
wide
bro?
flanks of the deck. The Sul'dam
Hope you're
straightened
doing
when they
good.
saw her, proud as the silver lightning in the red panels on their skirts. The gray-clad Domani knelt erect, full of their own pride. Except for poor Lydia, who crouched over her knees and tried to press her
How's your
tear-stained
evening
face
going?
against the deck. Ianel, holding the red-haired Domani's leash, scowled down at her. Tuon sighed. Lydia had been responsible for her anger last night. No, she had caused it, but Tuon herself was responsible for her own emotions. She had commanded the Domani to read her fortune, and she should not have ordered her caned because she disliked what she heard. Bending, she cupped Lydia's chin, laying long, red-enameled fingernails against the Domani's freckled cheek, and drew her up to sit on her heels, which produced a wince and a fresh set of tears that Tuon carefully wiped away with her fingers as she pulled the Damani upright on her knees. Lydia is a good Damani, Ianel, she said. Paint her welts with tincture of sulphur, and give her Lionheart for the pain until the welts are gone. And until they are gone, she is to have a sweet custard with every meal. As the High Lady commands,
Hey, Manic Mouth, how you doing?
But she smiled slightly.
Hope you're doing
All
well.
the Sultan were fond of
And
Lydia,
welcome.
and she had not liked punishing the Damani.
Well, listen, all y'all here.
But I will take her for a run.
What do you think this one, Manic Mouth?
Lydia twisted her head around to kiss Tuon's palm and murmured, Lydia's mistress.
The honey barrel that
Lydia will not get fat.
I stuffed all this
Making
part
her
with
way
some
along the two lines, Tuon
some
said
smoke a while
words
back.
to each Sultan and petted each of
What's
the
that?
Damani. The 6 she had brought with her were her best, and they beamed at her with a fondness equal to hers for them. They had competed eagerly to be chosen. Plump yellow-haired
So,
Gali and Dani,
sticky.
sisters who hardly needed the Sultan's direction.
That's all y'all here.
her
Let's
hair
do
as
it,
gray
Dad.
as her eyes, but still the most agile in her spinning. Sarah, with red ribbons in her tightly curled black hair, the strongest and proud as a Sultan. Tiny Mylan, shorter even than Tuon herself. Mylan was Tuon's special pride among the 6. Many had thought it odd when Tuon tested for Sultan on reaching adulthood, though none could blame her then, except her mother, who had allowed this by remaining silent. Actually becoming a Sultan was unthinkable, of course, but she found as much enjoyment in training Damani as in training horses, and she was as good at one as the other. Mylan
Hope
was
everyone's doing well out there
the
tonight.
pale little Damani had been half dead with shock and fear, refusing to eat or drink when Tuon brought her on the docks at Shon Kefar. The Bear Sultan all had despaired, saying she would not live long, but now Mylan smiled up at Tuon and leaned forward to kiss her hand before she even reached to stroke the Damani's dark hair. Once skin and bones, she was becoming a trifle plump. Instead of rebuking her, Petrona, who held her leash, let a smile pierce her usually stern black face, and murmured that Mylan was a perfect Damani. It was true. No one would believe now that once she had called herself
Let it
Aes
cool
Sedai.
down.
Before leaving, Tuon gave a few orders concerning the Damani's diet and exercise. The Sultan knew what to do, just like the other 12 in Tuon's entourage, or they would not have been in her service. But she believed no one should be allowed to own Damani unless they took an active interest. She knew the quirks of every one of hers as well as she knew her own face. In the outer cabin, the Death Watch guards, lining the walls in armor lacquered blood red and nearly black green. Had been charged personally with Tuon's safety. Any or all would die to protect her. They would die if she did. Every man had volunteered, asked to be in her guard. Seeing the veil, grizzled Captain Messenge ordered only 2 to accompany her on deck, where 24 Ogier gardeners in the red and green made a line to either side of the doorway, great black-tasseled axes upright in front of them, and grim eyes watching for any danger even here. They would not die if she did, but they also had asked to be in her guard, and she would rest her life in any of those huge hands without...
How's everyone's night going?
The ribbed sails on the Kidron's 3 tall masts were taut with the cold wind that drove the vessel toward the land that lay ahead, a dark shore near enough that she could make out hills and headlands. Men and women filled the deck, all of the blood on the vessel in their fingers, ignoring the wind that whipped their cloaks as they ignored the barefoot men and women of the ship's crew who darted between them. Some of the nobles were much too ostentatious about ignoring the crew, as though they could run the ship while kneeling or bowing every 2 paces. Prepared for prostration, the blood made slight bows instead, one equal to another when they saw her veil. Uriel, the sharp-nosed man everyone thought was her secretary, went to one knee. He was her secretary, of course, but also her hand, commanding her seekers. The Makura woman flung herself down prostrate and kissed the deck before a few quiet words from Uriel made her get back to her feet, blushing and smoothing her pleated red skirts. Tuon had been uncertain about taking her into service back in Tanchico, but the woman had pleaded to have her veil. She hated Aes Sedai and her bones for some reason, and despite the rewards already given for her extremely valuable information, she hoped to do him more injury. Bowing her head to the blood, Tuon climbed to the quarterdeck, followed by the 2 Deathwatch guards. The wind made handling her cape difficult, and pressed her veil against her face one moment, then flailed it over her head the next. It did not matter. That she wore it was sufficient. Her personal banner, 2 golden lions harnessed to an ancient war cart, flew at the stern above the 6 helmsmen struggling to control the long tiller. The Raven and Roses would have been packed away as soon as the first crewman to see her veil could pass the word. Kidron's captain, a wide, weathered woman with white hair and the most incredible green eyes, bowed as Tuon's slipper touched the quarterdeck, then immediately returned her attention to her ship. Anath was standing by the railing in unrelieved black silk, outwardly undisturbed by the chill wind in spite of her lack of a cloak or cape. A slender woman, she would have been tall even for a man. Her charcoal dark face was beautiful, but her large black eyes seemed to pierce like awls. Tuon's Sophaea, her truth speaker, named by the Empress, might she live forever, when Neferi died. A surprise, with Neferi's left hand trained and ready to replace her, but when the Empress spoke from the Crystal Throne, her word was law. You certainly were not supposed to be afraid of your Sophaea, yet Tuon was, a little. Joining the woman, she gripped the railing, and had to loosen her hands before she broke a lacquered nail. That would have meant very bad luck. Anath said. The word like a nail was driven into Tuon's skull. The tall woman frowned down at her, and contempt lay thick in her voice. You hide your face, in a way, and now you are just the High Lady Tuon, except that everyone still knows who you really are, even if they won't mention it. How long do you intend carrying on this? Anath's full lips sneered, and she made a curt, dismissive gesture with one slim hand. I suppose this idiocy is over having the Damani chained. You are a fool to think your eyes are downcast by a little thing like that. What did she say to make you angry? No one seems to know, except that you threw a tantrum I am sorry to have missed. Tuon made her hands still on the railing. They wanted to tremble. She forced her face to maintain a stern appearance. I will wear the veil until an omen tells me the time has come to remove it, Anath, she said, schooling her voice to calm. Only luck had kept anyone from overhearing Lydia's cryptic words. Everyone knew that Damani could foretell the future, and if any of the blood had heard, they would all have been chattering behind their hands about her fate. Anath laughed rudely and began telling her again what a fool she was, in greater detail this time. Much greater detail. She did not bother to lower her voice. Captain Tehan was staring straight ahead, but her eyes were almost falling out of her lined face. Tuon listened attentively, though her cheeks grew hotter and hotter until she thought her veil might burst into flame. Many of the blood called their voices Sophaea, but voices of the blood were Sojin, and knew they could be punished if their owners were displeased by what they said, even if they were called Sophaea. A speaker of truth could not be commanded or coerced or punished in any way. A truth speaker was required to tell the stark truth whether or not you wanted to hear it, and to make sure that you heard. Those blood who called their voices Sophaea thought that Alguin, the last man to sit on the Crystal Throne almost 1,000 years ago, had been insane because he let his Sophaea live and continue in her post after she slapped his face before the entire court. They did not understand the traditions of her family any more than the goggle-eyed captain did. The Deathwatch guards' expressions never altered behind the half-concealing cheek pieces of their helmets. They understood. Thank you, but I do not need a penance, she said politely, when Anath finally ceased her harangue. Once, after she cursed Neferi for dying by something as stupid as a fall downstairs, she had asked her new Sophaea to perform that service for her. Cursing the dead was enough to make you Sai Morsiev for months. The woman had been almost tender about it, in an odd fashion, though she left her weeping for days, unable to don even a shift. That was not why she refused the offer, though. A penance must be severe, or it was useless in redressing balance. No, she would not take the easier way because she had made her decision. And she had to admit because she wanted to resist her Sophia's advice, wanted not to listen to her at all. As Selucia said, she always had been headstrong. Refusing to listen to your truth speaker was abominable. Perhaps she should accept, after all, to redress that balance. 3 long gray porpoises rose beside the ship and sounded. 3, and they did not rise again. Hold to your chosen course. When we are ashore, she said, the High Lady Suroth must be commended. Hold to your chosen course. And her ambition must be looked into. She has done more with the Forerunners than the Empress, may she live forever, dreamed of. But success on such a scale often breeds ambitions to match. Peeved at the change of subject, Anath drew herself up, lips compressing. Her eyes glittered. I'm sure Suroth has only the best intentions of the Empire for ambition, she said curtly. Tuon nodded. She herself was not sure at all. That sort of sureness could lead to the Tower of the Ravens, even for her. Perhaps especially for her. I must find a way to make contact with the Dragon Reborn as soon as possible. He must kneel before the Crystal Throne before Tarmon Gaiden, or all is lost. The prophecies of the dragon said so, clearly. Anath's mood changed in a flash. Smiling, she laid a hand on Tuon's shoulder almost possessively. That was going too far, but she was Sophia, and the feel of ownership might have been only in Tuon's mind. You must be careful, Anath purred. You must not let him learn how dangerous you are to him until it is too late for him to escape. She had more advice, but Tuon let it wash over her. She listened enough to hear, yet it was nothing she had not heard 100 times before. Ahead of the ship she could make out the mouth of a great harbor, Ebu Dar, from where the Koren would spread as it was spreading from Tanchico. The thought gave her a thrill of pleasure, of accomplishment. Behind her veil she was merely the High Lady Tuon, of no higher rank than many others of the blood. But in her heart, always, she was Tuon Athaim Cora Paindrag, daughter of the 9 Moons, and she had come to reclaim what had been stolen from her ancestor.
Chapter 15. In Need of a Bell Founder. The box-like wagon reminded Matt of tinker wagons he had seen, a little house on wheels, though this one, filled with cabinets and workbenches built into the walls, was not made for a dwelling. Wrinkling his nose at the odd, acrid smells that filled the interior, he shifted uncomfortably on his 3-legged stool, the only place for anyone to sit. His broken leg and ribs were near enough healed, and the cuts that he had suffered when that whole bloody building fell on his head, but the injuries still pained him now and then. Besides, he was hoping for sympathy. Women loved to show sympathy, if you played it out right. He made himself stop twisting his long signet ring on his finger. Let a woman know you were nervous, and she put her own construction on it, and sympathy went right out the window. Listen, Alundra, he said, assuming his most winning smile. By this time, you must know the Seanchan won't look twice at fireworks. Those Damani do something called skylights that makes your best fireworks look like a few sparks flying up the chimney, so I hear. No offense meant. Me, I have not seen these so-called skylights myself, she replied dismissively in her strong Tarabana accent. Her head was bent over a wooden mortar the size of a large keg on one of the workbenches, and despite a wide blue ribbon gathering her dark, waist-length hair loosely at the nape of her neck, it fell forward to hide her face. The long white apron with its dark smudges did nothing to conceal how well her dark green dress fit over her hips, but he was more interested in what she was doing. Well, as interested. She was grinding at a coarse black powder with a wooden pestle nearly as long as her arm. The powder looked a little like what he had seen inside fireworks he had cut open, but he still did not know what went into it. In any event, she went on, unaware of his scrutiny, I will not give you the guild's secrets. You must understand this, yes? Matt winced. He had been working on her for days to bring it to this point, ever since a chance visit to Valan Luca's traveling show revealed that she was here in Ebu Dar, and all the while he had dreaded that she would mention the Illuminators Guild. But you aren't an Illuminator anymore, remember? They kicked, you said you left the guild. Not for the first time, he considered a small reminder that he had once saved her from 4 guild members who wanted to cut her throat. That sort of thing was enough to make most women fall on your neck with kisses and offers of whatever you wanted. But there had been a notable lack of kisses when he actually saved her, so it was unlikely she would begin now. Anyway, he went on airily, you don't have to worry about the guild. You've been making night flowers for how long? And nobody has come around trying to stop you. Why, I'll wager you never see another Illuminator. What have you heard? She asked quietly, her head still down. The pestil's rotation slowed almost to a stop. Tell me. The hair on his scalp nearly stood on end. How did women do that? Hide every clue, and they still went straight to what you wanted to conceal. What do you mean? I hear the same gossip you do, I suppose. Mostly about the Shanshan. She spun around so fast that her hair swung like a flail, and snatched the heavy pestle up in both hands, brandishing it overhead. Perhaps 10 years or so older than he, she had large, dark eyes and a small, plump mouth that usually seemed ready to be kissed. He had thought about kissing her a time or two. Most women were more amenable after a few kisses. Now, her teeth were bared, and she looked ready to bite off his nose. Tell me, she commanded. I was playing at dice with some Shanshan down near the docks, he said reluctantly, keeping a careful eye on the upraised pestle. A man might bluff and bluster and walk away if the matter was not serious, but a woman could crack your skull on a whim. And his hip was aching and stiff from sitting too long. He was not sure how quickly he could move from that stool. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but the guild doesn't exist anymore, Aludra. The chapter house in Tanchico is gone. That had been the only real chapter house in the guild. The one in Kyrian was long abandoned now, and for the rest, Illuminators only traveled to put on displays for rulers and nobles. They refused to let Shanshan soldiers inside the compound, and tried to, when they broke in anyway. I don't know what happened. Maybe a soldier took a lantern where he shouldn't have, but half the compound exploded, as I understand it. Probably exaggeration, but the Shanshan believed one of the Illuminators used the one power, and He sighed and tried to make his voice gentle. Blood and ashes, he did not want to tell her this. But she was glaring at him, that bloody club poised to split his scalp. Aludra, the Shanshan gathered up everyone left alive at the chapter house and some Illuminators that had gone to Amador, and everybody in between who even looked like an Illuminator. And they made them all Dako Vale. That means... I know what it means, she said fiercely. Swinging back to the big mortar, she began pounding away with the pestle so hard that he was afraid the thing might explode if that powder really was what went inside fireworks. Fools, she muttered angrily, thumping the pestle loudly in the mortar. Great blind fools! With the mighty you must bend your neck a little and walk on. But they would not see it. Sniffing, she scrubbed at her cheeks with the back of her hand. You are wrong, my young friend. So long as one Illuminator lives, the Guild, it lives too. And me, I still live. Still not looking at him, she wiped her cheeks with her hand again. And what would you do if I gave you the fireworks? Hurl them at the Shanshan from the catapult, I suppose? Her snort told what she thought of that. And what's wrong with the idea? He asked defensively. A good field catapult, a scorpion, could throw a 10-pound stone 500 paces, and 10 pounds of fireworks would do more damage than any stone. Anyway, I have a better idea. I saw those tubes you used to toss night flowers into the sky. 300 paces or more, you said? Tip one on its side, more or less, and I'll bet it could toss a night flower 1,000 paces. Peering into the mortar, she muttered almost under her breath. Me, I took too much, he thought it was, and something about pretty eyes that made no sense. He hurried on to stop her from starting up about guild secrets again. Those tubes are a lot smaller than a catapult, Aludra. If they were well hidden, the Seanchan would never know where they came from. You could think of it as paying them back for the chapter house. Turning her head, she gave him a look of respect, mingled with surprise, but he managed to ignore that. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and there were tear stains on her cheeks. Maybe if he put an arm around her. Women usually appreciated a little comforting when they cried. Before he could even shift his weight, she swung the pestle between them, pointing it at him like a sword with one hand. Those slender arms must be stronger than they looked. The wooden club never wavered. Light, he thought. She couldn't have known what I was going to do. This is not bad, for one who only saw the lofting tubes a few days ago, she said. But me, I have thought about this long before you. I had reason. For a moment, her voice was bitter, but it smoothed out again, and became a little amused. I will set you the puzzle, since you are so clever, no? She said, arching an eyebrow. Oh, she definitely was amused by something. You tell me what use I might have for a bell founder, and I will tell you all of my secrets, even the ones that will make you blush, yes? Now that did sound interesting. But the fireworks were more important than an hour snuggling with her. What secrets did she have that could make him blush? He might surprise her there. Not all of those other men's memories that had been stuffed into his head had to do with battles. A bell maker, he mused, without a notion of where to go from there. None of those old memories gave even a hint. Well, I suppose a bell maker could... maybe... No, she said, suddenly brisk. You will go and return in 2 or 3 days. I have the work to do. You are distracting with all of your questions and wheedling. No arguments. You will go now. Glowering, he rose and clapped his wide-brimmed black hat onto his head. Wheedling? Wheedling? Blood and bloody ashes. He had dropped his cloak in a heap by the door on entering, and he grunted softly, bending to pick it up. He had been sitting on that stool most of the day, but maybe he had made a little headway with her. If he could solve her puzzle, anyway. Alarm bells. Gongs to sound the hour. It made no sense. I might think of kissing such a smart young man as you, if you did not belong to another, she murmured in decidedly worn tones. You have such a pretty bottom. He jerked her right, keeping his back to her. The heat in his face was pure outrage, but she was sure to say he was blushing. He could usually manage to
that's what I'm doing too.
Unless someone brought it up. There had been an incident or 3 in taverns.
Some hash, nice.
While he was flat on his back,
Me,
his
not
leg
so
in
much
splints,
hash
and his
as
ribs strapped and bandages
somewhat
just
I
about
agree.
everywhere else. Tylen had hidden all of his clothes. He had not found where yet, but surely they were hidden, not burned. After all, she could not mean to hold on to him forever. All that remained of his own were his hat and the black silk scarf tied around his neck, and the silvery foxhead medallion, of course, hanging on a leather cord under his shirt, and his knives. He really would have felt lost without those. When he finally managed to crawl out of that bloody bed, the bloody woman had had new clothes made for him, with her sitting there watching the bloody seamstresses measure and fit him. Snowy lace at his wrists almost hid his bloody hands unless he was careful, and more spilled from his neck almost to his flaming waist. Tylen liked lace on a man. His cloak was a brilliant scarlet, as red as his 2 tight breeches, and edged with golden scroll work and white roses of all bloody things, not to mention a white oval on his left shoulder, with House Mitsubar's green sword and anchor. His coat was blue enough for a tinker, worked in red and gold Tyran mazes across the chest and down the sleeves for good measure. He did not like recalling what he had been forced to go through to convince Tylan to leave off the pearls and sapphires, and the light alone knew what else she had wanted. And it was short, to boot. Indecently short. Tylan liked his bloody bottom, too, and she did not seem to mind who saw it. Settling the cloak around his shoulders, it was some covering at least. He grabbed his shoulder-high walking staff from where it was leaning beside the door. His hip and leg were going to ache until he could walk the pain away. "In 2 or 3 days, then," he said, with as much dignity as he could muster. Eludra laughed softly. Not softly enough that he could not hear, though. Light, but a woman could do more with a laugh than a dockside bully boy with a string of curses, and just as deliberately. Limping out of the wagon, he slammed the door behind him as soon as he was far enough down the wooden steps that were fastened to the wagon bed. The afternoon sky was just like the morning sky had been, gray and blustery, thatched with sullen clouds. A sharp wind gusted fitfully. Altara had no true winter, but what it did have was enough to be going on with. Rather than snow, there were icy rains and thunderstorms racing in off the sea, and in between it was damp enough to make the cold seem harder. The ground had a sodden feel under your boots even when it was dry. Scowling, he hobbled away from the wagon. Women. Eludra was pretty, though, and she did know how to make fireworks. A bell founder? Maybe he could make it a short 2 days, so long as Eludra did not start chasing him. A good many women seem to be doing that of late. Had Tylan changed something about him to make women pursue him the way she herself did? No. That was ridiculous. The wind caught his cloak, flaring it behind him, but he was too absorbed to master it. A pair of slender women, acrobats, he thought, gave him sly smiles as they passed, and he smiled and made his best leg. Tylan had not changed him. He was still the same man he'd always been. Luca's show was 50 times as large as what Tom had told him about, maybe more. A sprawling hodgepodge of tents and wagons the size of a large village. Despite the weather, a number of performers were practicing where he could see them. A woman in a flowing white blouse and breeches as tight as his swung back and forth on a sagging rope slung between 2 tall poles, then threw herself off and somehow caught her feet in the rope just before she hurtled to the ground below. Then she twisted to catch the rope with her hands, pulled herself back to her seat, and began the same thing again. Not far off, a fellow was running on top of an egg-shaped wheel. It must have been a good 20 feet long, mounted on a platform that put him higher above the ground when he dashed across the narrow end than the woman who was going to break her full neck soon. Matt eyed a bare-chested man who was rolling 3 shiny balls along his arms and across his shoulders without ever touching them with his hands. That was interesting. He might be able to manage that himself. At least those balls would not leave you bleeding and broken. He had had enough of that to suit him in a lifetime. What really caught his eyes, however, were the horse lines. Long horse lines, where 24 men bundled against the cold were shoveling dung into barrows. Hundreds of horses. Supposedly, Luca had given shelter to some Shonchan animal trainer, and his reward had been a warrant signed by the High Lady Suroth herself, allowing him to keep all of his animals. Matt's own pips was secure, saved from the lottery ordered by Suroth because he was in the Tarasin Palace stables, but getting the gelding out of the stables was beyond him. Tylan, as good as had a leash around his neck, and she did not intend to let him go any time soon. Turning away, he considered having Vannin steal some of the show's horses if the talks with Luca went badly. From what Matt knew of Vannin, it would be an evening stroll for the unlikely man. Fat as he was, Vannin could steal and ride any horse ever foaled. Unfortunately, Matt doubted he himself could sit a saddle for more than a mile. Still, it was something to consider. He was growing desperate. Limping along, idly eyeing tumblers and jugglers and acrobats at their practice, he wondered how matters had come to this pass. Blood and ashes. He was Taviran. He was supposed to shape the world around him. But here he was, stuck in Ebu Dar, Tylan's pet and toy. The woman had not even let him heal completely before leaping on him again like a duck on a beetle, while everyone else was having a fine time of it. With those kinswomen fawning at her heels, likely Nynaeve was lording it over everyone in sight. Once Egwene realized those stark raving mad Aes Sedai, who had named her Amarlin, did not really mean it, Talmanas and the Band of the Red Hand were ready to spirit her away. Like Elaine might be wearing the rose crown by now, if he knew her. Rand and Perrin probably were lolling in front of a fire in some palace, swilling wine and telling jokes. He grimaced and rubbed at his forehead as a faint rush of colors seemed to swirl inside his head. That happened lately whenever he thought about either man. He did not know why, and he did not want to know. He just wanted it to stop. If only he could get away from Ebu Dar. And take the secret of fireworks with him, of course. But he would take escape over the secret any day. Tom and Beslan were still where he had left them, drinking with Luca in front of Luca's elaborately decorated wagon. But he did not join them immediately. For some reason, Luca had taken an instant dislike to Mat Cauthon. Mat returned the favor, but with reason. Luca had a smug, self-satisfied face and a way of smirking at any woman in sight. And he seemed to think every woman in the world enjoyed looking at him.
I'll be right
Like
back.
the man was married. Sprawled in a gilded chair he must have stolen from a palace, Luca was laughing and making expansive, lordly gestures to Tom and Beslan, seated on the benches to either side of him. Golden stars and comets covered Luca's brilliant red coat and cloak. A tinker would have blushed. His wagon would have made a tinker weep. Much larger than Eludra's work wagon, the thing appeared to have been lacquered. The faces of the moon repeated themselves in silver all the way around the wagon, and golden stars and comets in every size covered the rest of the red and blue surface. In that setting, Beslan looked almost ordinary in a coat and cloak worked in swooping birds. Tom, knuckling wine from his long white mustaches, seemed positively drab in plain bronze-colored wool and a dark cloak. One person who should have been there was not, but a quick glance around found a cluster of women at a nearby wagon. They were every age from his own up to graying hair, but every one of them was giggling at what they surrounded. Sighing, Mat made his way there. "Oh, I just cannot decide," came a boy's piping voice from the center of the group. "When I look at you, Marasi, your eyes are the prettiest I've ever seen. But when I look at you, Nylan, yours are. Your lips are ripe cherries, Jilin, and yours make me want to kiss them, Adria. And your neck, Jemine, graceful as a swan's." Swallowing an oath, Mat quickened his pace as much as he could and pushed through the women, muttering apologies left and right. Olver was in the middle of them, a short, pale boy, posturing and grinning at one woman, then another. That toothy grin alone was enough that any of them might decide to slap his ears off in a moment. "Please forgive him," Mat murmured, taking the boy's hand. "Come on, Olver. We have to get back to the city. Stop waving your cloak about. He doesn't know what he's saying, really. I don't know where he picks up that sort of thing." Luckily, the women laughed and ruffled Olver's hair as Mat led him away. Some murmured that he was a sweet boy, of all things. One slipped her hand under Mat's cloak and pinched his bottom. Women! Once clear, he scowled at the boy, tripping along happily at his side. Olver had grown since Mat first met him, but he was still short for his years. With that wide mouth and ears to match, he would never be handsome. "You could get yourself in deep trouble talking to women that way," Mat told him. "Women like a man to be quiet and well-mannered and reserved. Reserved and maybe a little shy. Cultivate those qualities and you'll do well." Olver gave him a gaping, incredulous stare, and Mat sighed. The lad had a fistful of uncles looking after him, and every one except Mat himself was a bad influence. Tom and Beslin were enough to restore Oliver's grin. Pulling his hand free, he ran ahead to them laughing. Tom was teaching him how to juggle and play the harp and the flute, and Beslin was teaching him how to use a sword. His other uncles gave him other lessons in a remarkably varied set of skills. Matt intended to start teaching him to use a quarterstaff and the Two Rivers bow once he had his strength back. What the boy was learning from Chelvannon or the Red Arms, Matt did not want to know. Luca rose from his fancy chair at Matt's approach, his fatuous smile fading to a sour grimace. Eyeing Matt up and down, he swept that ridiculous cloak around himself with a wide flourish and announced in a booming voice, "I am a busy man. I have much to do. It may be that I soon will have the honor of guesting the High Lady Suroth for a private showing." Without another word, he strode away holding the ornate cloak with just one hand, so gusts rippled it behind him like a banner. Matt gathered his own with both hands. The cloak was for warmth. He had seen Suroth in the palace, though never closely. As closely as he wanted, though. He could not imagine her giving a moment to Balan Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, as the streamer strung between two tall poles at the entrance to the show announced in red letters a pace high. If she did, likely she would eat the lions, or frighten them to death. "Has he agreed yet, Tom?" he asked quietly, frowning after Luca. "We can travel with him when he leaves Abu Dar," the weathered man replied. "For a price." He snorted, blowing out his mustaches, and irritably raked a hand through his white hair. "We should eat and sleep like kings for what he wants, but knowing him, I doubt we will. He doesn't think we're criminals, since we're still walking free, but he knows we're running from something, or we would travel some other way. Unfortunately, he does not intend to leave until spring, at the earliest." Matt considered several choice curses. Not until spring? The light knew what Tylan would have done to him, would have him doing by spring. Maybe Vannon stealing horses was not such a bad notion. "Gives me more time for dice," he said, as if it did not matter. "If he wants as much as you say, I need to fatten my purse. One thing you can say for the Shanchan, they don't seem to mind losing." He tried to be careful how long he let his luck run, and he had not faced any threats of having his throat slit for cheating, at least since he had been able to leave the palace on his own feet. At first, he had believed it was his luck spreading, or perhaps being Tiberan finally coming in for something useful. Beslin regarded him gravely. A dark, slender man, a little younger than Matt, he had been blithely rakish when Matt first met him, always ready for a round of the taverns, especially if it was with women or a fight. Since the Shanchan came, he had grown more serious, though. To him, they were very serious business. "My mother won't be pleased if she learns I am helping her pretty leave Abu Dar, Matt. She will marry me to someone with a squint and a mustache like a Tarabunner foot soldier." After all this time, Matt still winced. He could never get used to Tylan's son thinking what his mother was doing with Matt was all right. Well, Beslin did believe she had become a little too possessive. Just a little, mind. But that was the only reason he was willing to help. Beslin claimed Matt was what his mother needed to take her mind off the agreements she had been forced into by the Shanchan. Sometimes Matt wished he was back in the Two Rivers, where at least you knew how other people thought. Sometimes he did. "Can we return to the palace now?" Oliver said, more a demand than a question. "I have a reading lesson with the Lady Rizal. She lets me rest my head on her bosom while she reads to me." "A notable achievement, Oliver," Tom said, stroking his mustaches to hide a smile. Leaning closer to the other two men, he pitched his voice to escape the boy's ears. "The woman makes me play the harp for her before she lets me rest my head on that magnificent pillow." "Rizal makes everyone entertain her first," Beslin chuckled in a knowing way, and Tom stared at him in astonishment. Matt groaned. It was not his leg this time, or the fact that every man in Ebu Dar seemed to be choosing the bosom they rested their heads on, except for Matt Coffin. Those bloody dice had just started tumbling in his head again. Something bad was coming his way. Something very bad. Chapter 16. An Unexpected Encounter. The walk back to the city was better than 2 miles, across low hills that worked the ache out of Matt's leg and put it back again before they topped a rise and saw Ebu Dar ahead, behind its extravagantly thick white-plastered wall that no siege catapult had ever been able to break down. The city within was white too, though here and there pointed domes bore thin stripes of color. The white-plastered buildings, white spires and towers, white palaces, gleamed even on a gray winter day. Here and there a tower ended in a jagged top, or a gap showed where a building had been destroyed. But in truth, the Seanchan conquest had occasioned little damage. They had been too fast, too strong, and in control of the city before more than scattered resistance could form. Surprisingly, such trade as there was this time of year had hardly faltered with the city's fall. The Seanchan encouraged it, though merchants and ship captains and crews were required to take an oath to obey the forerunners, await the return, and serve those who come home. In practice, that meant largely going about your life as usual, so few objected. The broad harbor was more crowded with ships every time Matt looked at it. This afternoon, it seemed he could have walked from Ebu Dar proper across to the Rahad, a rough quarter he would just as soon never revisit. Often in the days after he first managed to walk again, he had gone down to the docks to stare, not at the vessels with ribbed sails, or the sea-folk ships that the Seanchan were re-rigging and manning with their own crews, but at craft flying the golden bees of Ilion, or the sword in hand of Araduman, or the crescents of Tyr. He no longer did. Today, he barely glanced toward the harbor. Those dice spinning in his head seemed to roar like thunder. Whatever was going to happen, he very much doubted he would like it. He seldom did, when the dice gave warning. Though a steady stream of traffic flowed out of the great arched gateway, and people afoot seemed to be squeezing through to get in, a thick column of wagons and ox carts stretching all the way back to the rise was waiting to enter and hardly moving. Everyone departing on a horse was Seanchan, whether with skin as dark as one of the sea folk or pale as a Carianan, and they stood out for more than being mounted. Some of the men wore voluminous trousers and odd tight coats with high collars that fit their necks snugly right to the chin, and rows of shiny metal buttons down the front, or flowing elaborately embroidered coats almost as long as a woman's dress. They were of the blood, as were the women in strangely cut riding dresses that seemed made of narrow pleats, with divided skirts cut to expose colorfully booted ankles, wide sleeves that hung to their feet in the stirrups. A few wore lace veils that hid all but their eyes, so their faces were not exposed to the lowborn. Most of the riders, by far, however, wore brightly painted armor of overlapping plates. Some of the soldiers were women, too, though there was no way to tell which, with those painted helmets like the heads of monstrous insects. At least none wore the black and red of the Death Watch guard. Even other Seanchan seemed nervous around them, and that was enough to warn Matt to walk wide around them. In any case, none of the Seanchan spared so much as a glance for 3 men and a boy slowly walking toward the city along a column of waiting carts and wagons. Well, the men walked slowly. Oliver skipped. Matt's leg was setting their pace, but he tried not to let the others see how much he was leaning on his staff. The dice usually announced incidents he managed to survive by the skin of his teeth. Battles, a building dropping on his head, Tylin. He dreaded what would happen when they stopped this time. Nearly all of the wagons and carts leaving the city had Seanchan driving or walking alongside, more plainly dressed than those on horses, hardly peculiar looking at all, but those in the waiting line were more likely to belong to Ebu Dare or folk from the surrounding area, Men in long vests, women with their skirts sewn up on one side to expose a stockinged leg or colorful petticoats, their wagons as well as their carts pulled by oxen. Outlanders dotted the column, merchants with small trains of horse-drawn wagons. There was more trade in winter here in the south than farther north, where merchants had to contend with snow-covered roads, and they came from far, some of them. A stout Domani woman with a dark beauty patch on her copper cheek, riding the lead of 4 wagons, clutched her flowered cloak around her and scowled at a man 5 wagons ahead of her in the line, a greasy-looking fellow, hiding long, thick mustaches behind a Tarabonner veil, beside the wagon driver. A competitor, no doubt. A lean Kandori, with a large pearl in her left ear and silver chains across her chest, sat her saddle calmly, gloved hand folded on the pommel, maybe still unaware that her gray gelding and her wagon teams alike would be put into the lottery once she was into the city. 1 horse in 5 had been taken from locals, and so as not to discourage trade, 1 in 10 from outlanders. Paid for, true, and a fair price in other days, but not nearly what the market would bear, given the demand. Matt always noticed horses, even if with only half his mind or less. A fat Karianin in a coat as drab as those of his wagon drivers was shouting angrily about the delay and letting his fine bay mare dance nervously. A very good confirmation on that mare. She would go to an officer, most likely. What was going to happen when the dice stopped? The wide-arched gates into the city had their guards, though it was likely only the Shonchan recognized them as such. Suldam, in their lightning-paneled blue dresses, threaded back and forth through the streams of traffic with gray-clad Domani on silvery Idam. Just one of those pairs would have been sufficient to quell any disturbance short of a full-scale assault, and maybe even that. But that was not the real reason for their presence. In the first days after Ebudar's fall, while he was still confined to bed, they had harrowed the city searching for the women they called Marath Domani, and now they made sure none could enter. The Suldam each carried an extra leash coiled on her shoulder just in case. Pairs patrolled the docks, too, meeting every arriving ship and boat. Beside the wide-arched gate into the city, a long platform displayed, on spikes 20 feet above the ground, the tarred but still recognizable heads of over a dozen men and 2 women who had fallen afoul of Shonchan justice. Above them hung the symbol for that justice, a headsman's slant-edged axe, with the haft wrapped in an intricately knotted white cord. A placard below each head announced the crime that had placed it there: murder or rape, robbery with violence, assault on one of the blood. Lesser offenses brought fines or flogging, or being made dakoveil. The Shonchan were even-handed about it. None of the blood themselves were on display. One of those who earned execution would be sent back to Shonchan, or strangled with the white cord. But 3 of those heads had been attached to Shonchan, and the weight of their justice fell on high as well as low. 2 placards marked rebellion, hung below the heads of the woman who had been mistress of the ships to the Afan Mier and her master of the blades. Matt had been through that gate often enough that he barely noticed the display now. Ulver skipped along singing a rhyming song. Veslin and Tom walked with their heads together. Once Matt caught a soft, risky business from Tom, but he did not care what they were talking about. Then they were into the long, dim tunnel that carried the road through the wall. The rumble of wagons passing through would have made listening impossible, even had he wanted to. Keeping close to the side, well away from the wagon wheels, Tom and Veslin forged ahead, talking in low murmurs, Ulver darting after them. But when Matt emerged into daylight again, he walked into Tom's back before he realized that all of them had stopped, hard beside the tunnel's mouth. On the point of making a caustic comment, he suddenly saw what they were staring at. People afoot pushing out of the tunnel behind him shoved them aside, but he just stared too. The streets of Ebudar were always full of people, but not like this. As though a dam had burst and sent a flood of humanity into the city. The throng packed the street in front of him from one side to the other, surrounding pools of livestock the like of which he had never seen before, spotted white cattle with long upswept horns, pale brown goats covered in fine hair that hung to the paving stones, sheep with 4 horns. Every street he could see looked as jammed. Wagons and carts inched through the mass where they moved at all. The shouts and curses of the wagon drivers and carters all but drowned in the babble of voices and the noise of the animals. He could not make out words, but he could distinguish accents. Slow, drawling Shonchan accents. Some of them nudged a neighbor and pointed at him in his bright clothing. They were gaping and pointing at everything, as if they had never seen an inn or a cutler's shop before. But he still growled under his breath and jerked his hat brim low over his eyes. "The return," Tom muttered, and if Matt had not been right at his shoulder, he would not have heard. "While we were taking our ease with Luca, the Karen has arrived." Matt had been thinking of this return that the Shonchan kept going on about as an invasion, an army. One of the wagon drivers shouted and waved her long-handled whip at some boys who had crawled up on the side of the wagon box to poke at what appeared to be grapevines in wooden tubs of earth. Another wagon held a long printing press, and still another, just managing to turn into the tunnel, carried what looked like brewers' vats and a faint smell of hops. Crates of strangely colored chickens and ducks and geese decorated some of those wagons, not birds for sale, but a farmer's stock. It was an army, all right, only not the sort he had imagined. This kind of army would be harder to fight than soldiers. "Stab my eyes. We'll have to wade to get through this," Veslin grumbled in disgust, rising on his toes to try peering farther ahead over the crowd. "How far before we find a clear street?" Matt found himself remembering what he had not really seen when it was in front of his eyes. The harbor full of ships. Full of ships. Maybe 2 or 3 times the vessels that had been there when they left for Luca's camp at first light, quite a few of them still maneuvering under sail, which meant there might be more still waiting to enter the harbor. Light. How many could have disgorged their cargo since morning? How many remained to be unloaded? Like, how many people could be carried on that number of ships? And why had they all come here instead of Tanchico? A shiver ran down his spine. Maybe this was not all of them. "You had best try to find your way by back streets and alleys," he said, raising his voice so they could hear over the cacophony. "You won't reach the palace before night otherwise." Veslin turned a frown on him. "You aren't returning with us? Matt, if you try to buy passage on the ship again, you know she won't go easy on you this time." Matt matched the Queen's son's scowl for scowl. "I just want to walk around a little," he lied. As soon as he returned to the palace, Tylan would start cosseting and petting him. It would not have been that bad, really. Not really. Except that she did not care who saw her caress his cheeks and whisper endearments in his ear, even her son. Besides, what if the dice in his head stopped when he reached her? Possessive was hardly the word for Tylan these days. Blood and ashes, the woman might have decided to marry him. He did not want to marry, not yet. But he knew who he was going to marry, and it was not Tylan Quintara Mitsubar. Only, what could he do if she decided differently? Suddenly, he remembered Tom's murmur of risky business. He knew Tom, and he knew Veslin. Oliver was gaping at the Shonchan as hard as they themselves were at everything around them. He started to dart away for a closer look, and Matt seized his shoulder just in time and pushed him, protesting, into Tom's hands. "Take the boy back to the palace and give him his lessons when Roselle is done with him. And forget whatever madness you have in mind. You could put your heads on display outside the gate, and Tylan's too. And his own. Never let that be forgotten." The 2 men stared back at him without any expression, as good as confirming his suspicions. "Perhaps I should walk with you," Tom said at last. "We could talk. You're remarkably lucky, Matt, and you have a certain flair for, shall we say, the adventurous." Veslin nodded. Over squirmed in Tom's grip, trying to stare at all the strange people at once, and unconcerned with what his elders were talking about. Matt grunted sourly. Why did people always want him to be a hero? Sooner or later, that sort of thing was going to get him killed. "I don't need to talk about anything. They are here, Veslin. If you couldn't stop them getting in, sure as morning, you won't be able to push them out. Rand will deal with them, if the rumors are anything to go by." Again, those whirling colors spun through his head, almost obliterating the sound of the dice for an instant. You took that bloody oath to wait on the return. We all did. Refusal had meant being put in chains and set to work on the docks or clearing the canals in the Rahad, which made it no oath at all in his book. Wait on Rand. The colors came once more and vanished. What in ashes, he just had to stop thinking about certain people. Again they swirled. It might come out right yet, if you give it time. You don't understand, Matt, Veslin said fiercely. Mother still sits on the throne, and Suroth says she will rule all of Altara. Not just what we hold around Ebu Dar, and maybe more besides. But Mother had to lie down on her face and swear fealty to some woman on the other side of the Arith Ocean. Suroth says I should marry one of their blood and shave the sides of my head, and Mother is listening to her. Suroth might pretend they are equals, but she has to listen when Suroth speaks. No matter what Suroth says, Ebu Dar isn't really ours anymore, and the rest won't be either. Maybe we can't push them out by force of arms, but we can make the country too hot to hold them. The White Cloaks found out. Ask them what they mean by the Altaran noon. Matt could guess without asking anyone. He bit his tongue to keep from pointing out that there were more Shonchan soldiers in Ebu Dar than there had been White Cloaks in all of Altara during the White Cloak War. A street full of Shonchan was no place for a flapping tongue, even if most did appear to be farmers and craftsfolk. I understand you're hot to put your head on a spike, he said quietly, as quietly as he could and still be heard in that din of voices and cattle lowing and geese honking. You know about their listeners. That fellow over there who looks like a stableman could be one, or that skinny woman with the bundle on her back. Veslin glowered so hard at the pair Matt had pointed out that if they really were listeners, they might report him for that alone. Maybe you'll sing a different song when they reach Andor, he growled, and pushed his way into the throng, shoving anyone who got in his way. Matt would have been unsurprised to see a fight break out. He suspected that was what the man was looking for. Tom turned to follow with Oliver, but Matt caught his sleeve. Cool his temper if you can, Tom. And cool your own while you're about it. I would think by this time you'd have had enough of shaving blind. My head is cool, and I'm trying to cool his, Tom said dryly. He can't just sit, though. It is his country. A faint smile crossed his leathery face. You say you won't take risks, but you will. And when you do, you'll make anything Veslin and I might try look like an evening stroll in the garden. With you around, even the barber is blind. Come along, boy, he said, swinging Oliver up onto his shoulders. Rizal might not let you rest your head if you're late for your lesson. Matt frowned after him as he strode away, making much better progress with Oliver straddling his neck than Veslin had. What did Tom mean? He never took risks unless they were forced on him. Never. He glanced casually toward the skinny woman and the fellow with the dung on his boots. Like they could be listeners. Anybody could be. It was enough to set a prickle between his shoulders, as if he were being watched. He inched a goodly distance along streets that actually grew thicker with people and animals and wagons the nearer he came to the docks. The stalls on the bridges over the canals had their shutters down. The street peddlers had picked up their blankets, and the tumblers and jugglers that usually entertained at every street crossing would have had no room to perform if they had not gone away too. There were too many Shonchan. That was how many there were, and maybe 1 in 5 a soldier, plain enough by their hard eyes and the set of their shoulders, so different from farmer or craftsman, even when they were not wearing armor. Now and then a group of Suldam and Damani moved along the street in a little eddy of clear space, more even than soldiers got. It was not given out of fear, at least not by the Shonchan. They bowed respectfully to the women with lightning-marked red panels on the blue dresses, and smiled with approval as the pairs passed by. Veslin was out of his mind. The Shonchan were not going to be driven off by anyone except an army of Ashaman, like the one rumor said had fought them to the east a week ago, or one armed with the Illuminator's secrets. What in the light could Aludra what with a bell founder? He took pains not to come in sight of the docks. He had learned his lesson on that. What he really wanted was a game of dice, one that would last well into the night. Preferably late enough that Tylin would be asleep when he returned to the palace. She had taken away his dice, claiming she did not like him gambling, though she did it after he talked her into wagering forfeits while he was still confined to bed. Fortunately, dice could always be found, and with his luck, it was always better to use the other man's dice anyway. Unfortunately, once he discovered she was not about to pay a forfeit of letting him go, the woman pretended not to know what he was talking about. He had used them to give her back a bit of her own medicine. A grave mistake, however much fun it had been at the time. Since the forfeits ran out, she had been twice as bad as before. The taverns and common rooms he entered were as packed as the streets, though, with barely room to lift a mug, much less toss dice, full of Seanchan laughing and singing, and glum-faced Ebudare who eyed the Seanchan in sullen silence. He still queried the innkeepers and tapsters on the chance they might have a cubbyhole he could rent, but one and all, they shook their heads. He had not really expected anything else. There had been nothing available even before all the new arrivals. Still, he began to feel as gloomy as the foreign merchants he saw peering into their wine and wondering how they were going to get their goods out of the city with no horses. He had gold to pay whatever Luca wanted, and more, but it was all in a chest in the Tarasin Palace, and he was not about to try taking enough out in one go, not after palace servants had carried him back from the docks like a stag taken in hunt. All he had been doing then was talking to ship captains. If Tylin learned, and she would, that he was trying to leave the palace with more gold than he needed for an evening of gambling, oh no, he had to have a room, a garret in some inn's attic the size of a wardrobe, anything, where he could hide away gold a little at a time, or he had to have a chance with the dice, one or the other. Luck or no luck, though, he eventually realized that he was going to find neither today. Those bloody dice were still tumbling in his head. Tumbling. He did not stay in any one place long, and not just for the lack of a game or a room. His colorful clothes, his shame-a-tinker-for-brightness clothes, drew eyes. Some of the Seanchan thought he was there for entertainment and tried to pay him to sing. He almost left them once or twice, but once they heard him, they would have demanded the money back. Some of the Ebudari men, with long curved knives tucked behind their belts, and a belly full of anger they could not take out on the Seanchan, thought to take it out on the buffoon who lacked only a painted face to look like a noble's fool. Matt ducked back into the crowded street whenever he saw such fellows eyeing him. He had learned the hard way that he was in no condition for a fight yet, and his killer's head going up beside the city gate would do him no good at all. Matt took rest where he could find it, on an empty barrel abandoned beside the mouth of an alleyway, on the rare bit of bench in front of a tavern that had room for one more, on a stone step until the building's owner came out and knocked his hat off with a swipe of her broom. His belly was kissing his backbone. He was beginning to feel that everyone was gaping at his garish clothes. The dank cold was seeping into his bones. The only dice he was going to find were those still thundering away in his head like horses' hooves. He did not think they had ever been this loud before. Nothing for it but to go back and be the Queen's bloody pet, he growled, using his staff to lever himself up off a cracked wooden crate lying at the side of the street. Several passers-by looked at him as if his face were already painted. He ignored them. Beneath his notice, they were. He was not beating them over the head with his staff as they deserved, goggling at a man that way. The streets really were as full as earlier, he realized, and it would be well after nightfall before he got back to the palace if he tried to make his way through the crowds. Of course, Tylin might be asleep by then. Maybe. His stomach growled, almost loudly enough to drown out the dice. She might order the kitchens not to feed him if he was too late. 10 hard-won paces through the press, and he turned down an alley, narrow and dark. There were no paving stones. The white plaster on the windowless walls was cracked and falling to expose the brick beneath, often as not. The air was rank with the fetid stench of decay, and he hoped that what squished under his boots was mud, even when it gave off a loathsome odor. There were no people either. He could step out with a good stride, or what passed for one today. He could hardly wait for the day he could walk a few miles again without panting and aching and needing to lean on a stick. Twisting alleys, most so narrow his shoulders brushed both sides, crisscrossed the city in a maze that was easy to get lost in if you did not know your way. He never took a wrong turn, even when a narrow, crooked passage suddenly forked into 3 or even 4 that all seemed to meander in roughly the same direction. There had been a good many times in Abu Dar when he needed to avoid eyes, and he knew these alleys like he knew his own hand, though oddly enough he still had the feeling he was being watched. He expected to feel that as long as he had to wear those bloody clothes. If he had to struggle through a mass of people and animals from one alley to another, and occasionally shove his way across a bridge that seemed a solid wall of humanity, he was still almost back to the palace in the time it would have taken him to go 3 streets otherwise. Hurrying into the shadowed passage between a well-lit tavern and a shuttered lacquerware shop, he wondered what the kitchens would have ready. More capacious than most, wide enough for 3 if they were friendly, this alley led out onto the Mulhara Square, almost in front of the Tarasin Palace. Suroth was living there, and the cooks had been outdoing themselves since she had had the lot of them flogged after her first meal. There might be oysters with cream, and perhaps gilded fish, and squid with peppers. 10 strides into the shadows, his foot came down on something that did not squish, and he went down in the freezing mud with a grunt, twisting at the last instant, so he did not land on his bad leg. Icy liquid immediately soaked through his coat. He hoped it was water. He grunted again when boots landed on his shoulder. The fellow toppled off of him, cursing and skidding deeper into the alley on the mud, and went to one knee, just managing to catch himself against the side of the tavern short of falling flat himself. Matt's eyes were accustomed to the dim light, enough for him to make out a slender, nondescript man. A man with what appeared to be a large scar on his cheek. Not a man, though. A creature he had seen rip out his friend's throat with one bare hand and take a knife out of its own chest and throw it back at him. And the thing would have landed right in front of him, in easy reach, if he had not tripped. Maybe a little twist of Taviran shaping had worked in his favor, thank the light. All that flashed through his head in the time it took the golem to catch itself against the wall and turn its head to glare at him. With an oath, Matt snatched his falling walking staff and awkwardly hurled it at the creature like a spear. At its legs, hoping to tangle them, gain a moment. The thing flowed aside like water, avoiding the staff, boots sliding a little in the mud, then threw itself toward Matt. The delay had been enough, though. As soon as the staff left his hand, Matt fumbled inside his shirt for the fox-head medallion, breaking the leather cord as he snatched the medallion out. The golem threw itself at him, and he swung the medallion desperately. Silver that had lain cool on his chest brushed across an outstretched hand with a hiss like bacon frying and a smell of burning flesh. Fluid as quicksilver, snarling, the thing tried to dodge by the whirling medallion to seize some part of Matt. Once it laid hands on him, he was as good as dead. It would not try to toy with him this time, as it had in the Rahad. Flailing continuously, he caught it with the fox head on the other hand, across the face, each time with a hiss and stench of burning, as if he had struck with a hot iron. Teeth bared, the golem backed away, but in a crouch on the balls of its feet, hands clawed, ready to jump at the slightest weakness. Not letting the spinning medallion slow, Matt pushed unsteadily to his feet, watching the thing that looked like a man. He wants you dead as much as he wants her, it had told him in the Rahad, smiling. It was not talking or smiling now. He did not know who the her was, or the he, but the rest was clear as good glass. And here he was, barely able to stay on his feet. His leg and hip ached like fire, and his ribs. Not to mention the shoulder the golem had landed on. He had to get back to the street, back among people. Maybe enough people would deter the thing. A small hope, but the only hope he could see. The street was not far. He could hear the babble of voices, hardly softened by distance at all. He took a careful step backward. His boot slid in something that gave off a foul smell and threw him against the tavern's wall. Only frantic swings of the silver fox head kept the golem back. Those voices in the street were so tantalizingly close. They might as well have been in Barcine. Barcine was long dead, and he would be too, soon. "He's down this alley," a man shouted. "Follow me! Hurry! He'll get away!" Matt kept his eyes on the golem. Its gaze flickered beyond him toward the street, and it hesitated. "I am ordered to avoid notice, save by those I harvest," it spat at him. "So you will live a little longer. A little longer." Spinning, it ran down the alley, slipping a little in the mud, yet still seeming to flow as it dodged around behind the tavern. Matt ran after it. He could not have said why, except that it had tried to kill him, would try again, and his hackles were stiff. So it was going to kill him at leisure, was it? If the medallion could hurt it, maybe the medallion could kill it. Reaching the corner of the tavern, he saw the golem at the same time that he glanced back and saw him. Again, the thing hesitated for an instant. The tavern's back door stood ajar, letting out the sounds of revelry. The creature stuck its hands into a hole left by a missing brick in the back wall of the building opposite the tavern, and Matt stiffened. It hardly seemed to need weapons, but if it had hidden one in there, he did not think he would survive facing that thing with any sort of weapon. Arms followed hands, and then the golem's head went into the hole. Matt's jaw dropped. The golem's chest slithered through, its legs, and it was gone. Through an opening maybe the size of Matt's two hands. "I don't think I've ever seen the like," someone said quietly beside him. And Matt gave a start at realizing he was no longer alone. The speaker was a stoop-shouldered, white-haired old man with a large hooked nose planted in the middle of a sad face and a bundle slung on his back. He was sliding a very long dagger into a sheath beneath his coat. "I have," Matt said hollowly, "in Shadar Logoth." Sometimes bits of his own memory he thought lost floated up out of nowhere, and that one had just surfaced watching the golem. It was one memory he wished had remained lost. "Not many survive a visit there," the old man said, peering at him. His weathered face looked familiar somehow, but Matt could not place him. "Whatever took you to Shadar Logoth?" "Where are your friends?" Matt said. "The people you were shouting to." The alleyway held only the two of them. The sounds from the street continued unabated and undisturbed by any cries about anyone getting away if they did not hurry. The old man shrugged. "I'm not certain anyone out there understood what I was shouting. It's hard enough understanding them. Anyway, I thought it might scare off the fellow. Seeing that, though," gesturing toward the hole in the wall, he laughed mirthlessly, showing gaps in his teeth. "I think maybe you and I both have the Dark One's own luck." Matt grimaced. He had heard that too often about himself, and he did not like it. Mainly because he was not sure it was not true. "Maybe we do," he muttered. "Forgive me. I should introduce myself to the man who saved my neck. I'm Matt Cawthon. Are you a newcomer to Abu Dar?" That bundle strapped to the fellow's back gave him the look of a man on the move. "We'll have a hard time finding a place to sleep." He took care with the gnarled hand the other man put in his. It was all knobs, as if every bone had been broken at the same time, and it healed badly. It had a strong grip, though.
You have a good one, Chris.
"I'm no Charin."
Definitely appreciate you stopping by, brother.
"No, I have been here some time, but my pallet in the attic of the Golden Ducks is now occupied by a fat Ilianer oil merchant who was rousted from his room this morning in favor of a Shan-Chan officer. I thought I'd find somewhere back in this alley for tonight." Rubbing the side of his big nose with a crooked, knobby finger, he chuckled as if sleeping in an alley were of no moment. "It will not be the first time I've slept rough, even in the city." "I think I can do better for you than that," Matt told him. But the rest of what he had been going to say died on his tongue. The dice were still spinning in his head, he realized. He had managed to forget them, with the golem trying to kill him, They were still bouncing, still waiting to land. If they were warning of something worse than the Golem, he did not want to know. Only he would. There was no doubt of that. He would, when it was too late. Chapter 17. Pink Ribbons. Cold winds gusted through the Mulhara, lifting Matt's cloak and threatening to freeze the mud kicking his clothing as he and Noel hurried out of the alley. The sun sat on the rooftops, half hidden, and the shadows stretched long. With one hand for his staff, and the other gripping the broken cord of the fox head stuffed into a coat pocket where he could snatch it out if need be, he had to let his cloak go where it would. He ached from head to foot. The dice rattled warning inside his skull, and he hardly noticed either thing. He was too busy trying to watch every direction at once, and wondering just how small a hole that thing could get through. He found himself uneasily eyeing cracks between the square's paving stones, though it hardly seemed likely the thing would come at him in the open. A hum carried from surrounding streets, but here only a slat-ribbed dog moved, running past the fountained statue of long-dead Queen Nerian. Some said her uplifted hand pointed to the ocean's bounty that had enriched Ebudar, and some that it pointed in warning of dangers. Others said her successor had wanted to draw attention to the fact that only one of the statue's breasts was uncovered, proclaiming that Nerian had only been of middling honesty. In other days, the Mulhara would have been full of strolling lovers and lingering street vendors and hopeful beggars at this hour, even in winter. But beggars found themselves snatched off the streets and put to work since the Seanchan came, and the rest stayed away even in daylight. The reason was the Tarasin Palace, that great mound of white domes and marble spires and wrought iron balconies, the residence of Tylan Quintara Mitsubar, by the grace of the light, Queen of Altara, or as much of Altara as lay within a few days' ride of Ebudar, mistress of the four winds and guardian of the Sea of Storms. And, perhaps more important, the residence of the High Lady Suroth, Sabel Meldarath, commanding the forerunners for the Empress of the Seanchan, might she live forever. A position of much greater eminence in
Hey,
Ebudar.
Scotty, how you doing?
Thailand's green-booted
Hope
guards
you're doing
stood at
well.
every entrance in their baggy white trousers and gilded breastplates worn over green coats, and so did men and women in those insectile helmets with armor striped in blue and yellow, or green and white, or any other combination you might happen to think of. The Queen of Altara required security and silence for her rest. Or rather, Suroth said she did, and what Suroth said Thailand wanted,
Oh, yeah,
Thailand
Scotty,
soon
that's good.
decided that she did indeed want. After a moment's consideration, Matt led Noel to one of the stable yard gates. There was more chance of getting a stranger in there than if he used the grand marble stairs that led down into the square. Not to mention a much better chance of getting all the mud off him before he had to face Thailand. She had made her displeasure markedly known the last time he came back disheveled after a tavern brawl. A handful of Ebudari guards stood to one side of the open gates with halberds, and the same number of Seanchan on the other with tasseled spears, all as stiff as Nerian's statue. The light's blessing on all here, Matt murmured politely to the Ebudari guards. It was always best to be polite to Ebudari until you were sure of them. Afterwards, too, for that matter. Even so, they were more flexible than the Seanchan. And on to you, my lord, their stocky officer replied, ambling forward, and Matt recognized him. Sullivan Sarat, a good fellow, always ready with a quip and possessing a fine eye for horses. Shaking his head, Sullivan tapped the side of his pointed helmet with the thin gilded rod of his office. Have you been in another fight, my lord? She will go up like a waterspout when she sees you. Squaring his shoulders and trying not to lean so obviously on his staff, Matt bristled. Ready with a quip. Come to think on it, the Sundark man had a tongue like a rasp, and his eye for horses was not all that fine either. Will there be any questions if my friend here beds down with my men? Matt asked roughly. There shouldn't be. There's room for one more with my fellows. Room for more than one, truth be told. 8 men had died so far, following him to Abu Dar. None for me, my lord, Sullivan said, though he eyed the scrawny man at Matt's side and pursed his lips judiciously. Noel's coat appeared of good quality, though, at least in the dim light, and he did have his
Hey,
lace,
Bastien, how you
and
doing?
in a better state than Matt's.
Give me 1 second,
Perhaps that
and we'll
tipped
do a
the
dab.
balance. And she doesn't need to know everything, so none from her either. Matt scowled, but before intemperate words could put himself and Noel in the soup kettle, 3 armored Shanshan galloped up to the gate, and Sullivan turned to face them. You and your lady wife live in the Queen's palace? Noel inquired, starting toward the gate. Matt pulled him back. Wait on them, he said, nodding toward the Shanshan. His lady wife? Bloody women? Bloody dice in his bloody head? I have dispatches for the High Lady Surath, one of the Shanshan announced, slapping a leather satchel hanging from one armored shoulder. Her helmet bore a single thin plume, marking her a low-ranking officer, and her horse was a tall dun gelding with a look of speed. The other 2 animals were sturdy enough, but there was nothing to be said for them beyond that. Enter with the blessings of the light, Sullivan said, bowing slightly. The Shanshan woman's bow from her saddle was a mirror of his. The blessings of the light be on you also, she drawled, and the 3 of them clattered into the stable yard. It is very strange, Sullivan mused, peering after the 3. They always ask permission of us.
Let's get it dab done real quick there.
He flicked his rod at the Shanshan guards on the other side of the gates. They had not stirred an inch from their rigid stance or even glanced at the arrivals that Matt had noticed. And what would they do if you said they couldn't go in? Noel asked quietly, easing the bundle on his back. Sullivan spun on his heel. It is enough that I have given oath to my queen, he said in an expressionless voice. And she has given hers. Where she has given it. Give your friend a bed, my lord, and warn him there are things better left unsaid in Abu Dar. Questions better left unasked. Noel looked befuddled and began protesting that he was simply curious, but Matt exchanged further benisons and courtesies with the Altaran officer, as quickly as he could, to be sure, and hustled his newfound acquaintance through the gates, explaining about listeners in a low voice. The man might have saved his hide from the Golan, but that did not mean he would let the fellow hand it over to the Shanshan. They had people called Seekers, too. From the little he had heard, even people who spoke freely about the Death Watch Guard locked their teeth when it came to the Seekers. From the little he had heard, Seekers made white-cloaked questioners look like boys tormenting flies. Nasty, but hardly anything to women. You see,
I see her chilling, listening to a book, dabbing, you know, getting ready for bedtime.
Spend a good deal of time with the Shanshan. Do you know the High Lady Surath as well, then?
Have a movie going on right over here on the TV.
Such high connections. I spend time with soldiers in taverns.
An oldie too. Well, somewhat of an oldie.
But Thailand let him. Light, he might as well be married.
It's an old skateboarding
Surath
movie.
doesn't know I'm alive, and he devoutly hoped it remained that way. The 3 Shanshan were already out of sight, their horses being led into the stables, but several dozen soldiers were giving Damani their evening exercise, walking them in stone-paved yards. Nearly half the gray-clad Damani were dark-skinned women, lacking the jewelry they had worn as windfinders. They were more like them in the palace and elsewhere. The Shanshan had had a rich harvest from seafolk vessels that had failed to escape. Most wore sullen resignation on their faces, but 7 or 8 stared ahead of them, lost and confused, disbelieving still. Each of those had a Shanshan-born Damani at her side, holding her hand or with an arm around her, smiling and whispering to her under the approving eyes of the women who wore the bracelets attached to their silvery collars. A few of them clutched the Damani walking with them as if holding to lifelines. It would have been enough to make Matt shiver if his damp clothes had not already been doing the job. He tried to hurry Noel across the yard, but the circle brought a demonic Sean Chen nor Athan Mier near him, linked to a plump, graying Suldam, an olive-skinned woman who might have passed for Altaran and someone's mother. A stern mother, a fractious child, in the way she regarded her charge. Teslin Baradin had fleshed out after a month and a half in Shonchen captivity, yet her ageless face still looked as if she ate briars 3 meals a day. On the other hand, she walked placidly on her leash and obeyed the Suldam's murmured directions without hesitation, pausing to bow very deeply to him and Noel. For her dark eyes flashed hatred at him, for she and the Suldam continued the circuit of the stable yard. Placidly, obediently. He had seen Damani upended and switched till they howled in this same stable yard for making any sort of fuss. Teslin mocked. She had done him no good turns, and maybe a few bad, but he would not have wished this on her. Better than being dead, I suppose, he muttered, moving on. Teslin was a hard woman, plotting every moment how to escape, yet hardness only took you so far. The mistress of the ships and her master died on the stake without ever screaming, but it had not saved them. Do you believe that? Noel asked absently, fumbling awkwardly with his bundle again. His broken hands had handled that knife well enough, but they seemed clumsy at everything else. Matt frowned at him. The silver eyedom seemed too much like the invisible power Tylan had on him. Then again, Tylan could tickle him under the chin the rest of his life if it kept him off the stake. Might he wish those bloody dice in his head would just stop and get it over with? No, that was a lie. Since he had finally realized what they meant, he had never wanted the dice to stop. The room Chell Vannin and the surviving Red Arms shared lay not far from the stables, a long white-plastered chamber, a low ceiling, and too many beds for those who remained alive. Vannin, a balding, suety heap, was lying on one in his shirt sleeves, an open book propped on his chest. That was surprised the man could read. His teeth, Vannin eyed Matt's mud-smeared clothes. "You've been fighting again?" he asked. "She won't like that, I reckon." He did not rise. With a few startling exceptions, Vannin considered himself as good as any lord or lady. "Trouble, Lord Matt," Arnon growled, leaping to his feet. He was a solid man, physically and by temperament, but his heavy jaw clenched, twisting crudely tattooed on his cheek. "Begging your pardon, but you're in no condition for it. Tell us what he looks like, and The last 3 gathered behind him with eager expressions, 2 grabbing for their coats, while still tucking in shirt tails. Metwin, a boyish-appearing Karianan, who was 10 years older than Matt, instead picked up his sword from where it was propped at the foot of his bed and eased a little of the blade out of the scabbard to check the edge. He was the best of them with a sword, very good indeed, though Gorderon came close to the blacksmith. Gorderon was not nearly as slow as his thick shoulders made him appear. A dozen Red Arms had followed Matt Koth and Dwebudar. 8 of those were dead, and the rest were stuck here in the palace where they could not pinch the maids, get into a fight over dice, and as they could staying in the innkeeper would see them carried out, maybe with their than they had been. No one can tell you what happened better than I can. Back on his head. He'll be betting in here with you. He saved my life tonight. That brought exclamations of shock and cries of approbation for Noel, not to mention slaps on the back that almost toppled the old fellow. Vannin went so far as to mark his place in the book with a fat finger and sit up on the side of his thin mattress. Setting his bundle down on the bed, Noel played elaborate gestures, laying down his own bowl, and even making himself a bit of a buffoon, slipping in the mud and gaping at the golem, while Matt fought like a champion. The man was a natural storyteller, as good as a gleeman for making you see what he described. Arnon and the Red Arms laughed genially, knowing what he was about, not stealing their captain's thunder, and approving of it. The laughter died when he came to Matt's attacker slipping away through a tiny hole in a wall. He made you see that, too. Vannin put down his book and spat through his teeth again. The golem had left Vannon and Harnan half dead in the Rahad. Half dead because it was after other prey. The thing wants me for some reason, it seems, Matt said lightly when the old man finished and sank onto the bed with his belongings, seemingly exhausted. It probably played at dice with me sometime, I don't recall. None of you has to worry, as long as you don't get between it and me. He grinned, trying to make it all a joke, but no one so much as smiled. In any case, I'll pop you in the morning. You'll book passage in the first ship leaving for Ilion, and take Ulver with you. Tom and Julian, too, if they'll go. He imagined the thief catcher would anyway. And Niram, and Lopin, of course. He'd gotten used to having a pair of serving men look after him, but he hardly needed them here. Talmanis must be somewhere close to Camelin by this time. You shouldn't have much trouble finding him. When they were gone, he would be alone with Tylan. Light he would rather face the golem again. Harnan and the other three red-arms exchanged looks, Fergus scratching his head as if he did not quite understand. He might not. The bony man was a good soldier, not the best mind, but good enough. Yet he was not very bright when it came to other things. That wouldn't be right, Harnan allowed finally. One thing, Lord Talmanas would have our hides if we came back without you. The other three nodded. Fergus could understand that. And you, Vannon? The fat man shrugged. I take that boy away from Rizal, and he'll gut me like a trout the first time I go to sleep. I would myself, in his boots. Anyway, I got time to read here. Don't get much chance for that, working as a farrier. That was one of the itinerant trades he claimed to follow. The other was stableman. In truth, he was a horse thief and poacher. The best in 2 countries, and maybe more. You're all mad, Matt said with a frown. Just because it wants me doesn't mean it won't kill you if you get the head. The offer stays open. Anyone who comes to his senses can go. I have seen your life before, Noel said suddenly. The stooped old man was the image of hard age and exhaustion, but his eyes were bright, studying Matt. Some men have an air about them that makes other men follow where they lead. Some lead to devastation, others to glory. I think your name may go as confused as Fergus. Vannon spat and lay back down, opening his book. If all my luck goes away, maybe, Matt muttered. He knew what it took to get into the histories. A man could get killed doing that sort of thing. Better clean up before she sees you, Fergus piped up suddenly. All that mud will put a burr under her saddle for sure. Snatching his hat off angrily, Matt stalked out without a word. Well, he stalked as well as he could, hobbling on a walking staff. Before the door closed behind him, he heard Noel starting a story about one time he sailed on a seafolk ship and learned to bathe in cold salt water. At least, that was how it began. He intended to get himself clean before Tylan saw him. He did. But as he limped through hallways hung with the flowered tapestries Abudari called summer hangings, for the season they evoked, 4 serving men in the palace's green and white livery and no fewer than 7 maids suggested he might want to bathe and change his clothes before the queen saw him, offering to draw him a bath in garments without her learning of it. They did not know everything about him and Tylan. Thank the light. No one but Tylan and himself knew the worst bits, but they knew too bloody much. Worse, they approved. Every last flaming servant in the whole flaming Tarasan palace. For one thing, Tylan was queen, and could do as she pleased, so far as they were concerned. For another, her temper had been on a razor's edge since the Seanchan captured the city, and if Matt Cawthon scrubbed in Brighton lace kept her from snapping their noses off for trifles, they would scrub behind his ears and wrap him in lace like a Sunday gift. Mud, he said to a pretty smiling maid, spreading her skirts in a curtsy. There was a twinkle in her dark eyes. The plunging neckline of her bodice displayed a fair amount of bosom to almost rival Rozelle's. Another day, he might have taken a little time to enjoy looking. What mud? I don't see any mud. Her mouth dropped open, and she forgot to straighten, staring at him with her knees bent as he hobbled away. Jewel and Sandar, rounding a corner quickly, nearly walked into him. The tyrant thief-catcher leaped back with a muffled oath, his swarthy face turning gray until he realized who had almost run him over. Then he muttered an apology and started to hurry on by. "Has Tom got you mixed into his foolishness, Julian?" Matt asked. Julian shared a room deep in the servants' quarters, and there was no excuse for him to be up here. In that dark tyrant coat flaring over his boot tops, Julian would stand out among the servants like a duck in a chicken coop. Suroth was strict about things like that, stricter than Tylen. The only reason for it Matt could see was whatever Tom and Beslin were meddling with. "No, don't bother telling me. I've made an offer to Harnan and the others, and it's open to you too. If you want to leave, I'll give you the money for it." Actually, Julian did not look ready to tell him anything. The thief-catcher tucked his thumbs behind his belt and met Matt's gaze levelly. "What did Harnan and the others say? And what is Tom doing that you call foolish? This is one set of rooftops he knows his way around better than you or I." "The Golan is still in Abu Dar, Julian." Tom knew that the game of houses was what he knew, and he loved sticking his nose into politics. "The thing tried to kill me earlier this evening." Julian grunted as if he had been hit in the pit of his belly, and scrubbed a hand through his short black hair. "I have a reason to stay a while longer," he said. "Even so." His air changed slightly to something stubborn and defensive and tinged with guilt. He had never shown a roving eye that Matt had seen, but when a man looked like that, it could only mean one thing. "Take her with you," Matt said. "Go? Well, you'll not be in Tyr an hour before you have a woman on each side. That's the thing about women. If one says no, there's always another will say yes." A serving man hurrying by with an armload of linen towels stared at Matt's muddiness in amazement, but Julian thought it was at him, snatched his thumbs free of his belt, and attempted to adopt a more humble stance, without much success. Tom might sleep with the servants, yet from the beginning he had somehow made it seem to be his own choice, an eccentricity, and no one thought it odd to see him up here, perhaps slipping into Rozelle's rooms that had once been Matt's. Julian had gone on at length about being a thief-catcher, never a thief-taker, and stared so many prickly lordlings and complacent merchants in the eye to show he was as good as they, that everyone in the palace knew who and what he was, and where he was supposed to be, which was below stairs. "My lord is wise," he said too loudly, and making a stiff, jerky bow. "My lord knows all about women. If my lord forgive a humble man, I must return to my place." Turning to go, he spoke over his shoulder, still in a carrying voice. "I heard today that if my lord comes back one more time looking like he's been dragged in the street, the queen intends taking a switch to my lord's person." And that was the stone that broke the wagon clean in two. Flinging open the doors of Tylen's apartments, Matt strode in, sailed his hat across the width of the room, and stopped dead, his mouth hanging open and everything he had planned to say frozen on his tongue. His hat hit the carpets and rolled, he did not see where. A gust of wind rattled the tall, triple-arched windows that led out onto a long, screened balcony overlooking the Mulhara. Tylen turned in a chair carved to look like gilded bamboo and stared at him over her golden wine cup. Waves of glossy black hair, touched with gray at the temples, framed a beautiful face with the eyes of a bird of prey, and not one best pleased at the moment. Inconsequential things seemed to leap at him. She kicked her crossed legs slightly, rippling her white petticoats. Pale green lace trimmed the oval opening in her gown that half exposed her full breasts, where the jeweled hilt of her marriage knife dangled. She was not alone. Suroth sat facing her, frowning into her wine cup and tapping long fingernails on the arm of her chair. A pretty enough woman, despite her hair being shaved to that long crest. except that she made Tylan seem a rabbit by comparison. 2 of those fingernails on each hand were lacquered blue. Seated at her side was a little girl, of all things, also in an elaborately flowered robe over pleated white skirts, but with a sheer veil covering her entire head. It seemed to be shaved completely, and wearing a fortune in rubies. Even in a state of shock, he noticed rubies and gold. A slender woman, nearly as dark as her stark black gown, and tall, even had she been Aiel, stood behind the girl's chair with her arms folded and ill-concealed impatience. Her wavy black hair was short, but not shaved at all, so she was neither of the blood nor Sojin. Imperiously beautiful, she put Tylan and Suroth both in the shade. He noticed beautiful women, too, even when he did feel hit in the head with a hammer. It was not the presence of Suroth or the strangers that jerked him to a halt, though. The dice had stopped, landing with a thunder that made his skull ring. That had never happened before. He stood there waiting for one of the Forsaken to leap out of the flames in the marble fireplace, or the earth to swallow the palace beneath him. "You aren't listening to me, Pigeon," Tylan cooed in dangerous tones. "I said, take yourself down to the kitchens and have a pastry until I have time for you. Have a bath while you're about it." Her dark eyes said, "We will discuss your mud later." In a daze, he ran it through again in his head. He had walked into the room, the dice had stopped, and nothing had happened. Nothing. "This man has
Hey,
been set
Soy,
upon,"
how you doing?
the tiny veiled figure said, rising. Her tone turned cold as the wind outside. "You told me the streets were safe, Suroth. I am displeased."
You know what? Let's do a dab.
Something
Have a safety
had to happen.
reason.
It already should have. Something always happened when the dice stopped. "I assure you, Tuan, the streets of Ebudar are as safe as the streets of Shandar itself," Suroth replied, and that pulled Matt out of his stupor. She sounded anxious. Suroth made other people anxious. A slender, graceful young man in the almost transparent robe of a Dako veil appeared at her side with a tall blue porcelain pitcher, bowing his head and silently offering to replenish her wine.
Yep,
And
safety
giving Matt
meeting.
another start. He had not realized anyone else was present in the room. The yellow-haired man in his indecent garment was not the only one either. A slim but nicely rounded, red-haired woman wearing the same sheer robe was kneeling beside a table that held spice bottles and more fine porcelain wine pitchers, and a small gilded brass brazier with the pokers needed for heating the wine. A praying, nervous-eyed serving woman wearing green and white House Mitsubar livery stood at the other end. And in one corner, so motionless that he still almost missed her, yet another shaman chap. A short woman, with half her golden head shaved and a bosom that might outmatch Rizel's if her dress of red and yellow panels had not covered her neck to the chin. Not that he had any real desire to find out. Shonchan were very touchy about their Sojin. Tylan was touchy about any woman. There had not been a serving woman younger than his grandmother in her apartments since he was able to get out of bed. Suroth looked at the graceful man as though wondering what he was, then shook her head wordlessly and turned her attention back to the child, Tuan, who waved the fellow away. The liveried serving maid scurried forward to take the pitcher from him and try to refill Tylan's cup, but the queen made a very small gesture that sent her back to the wall. Tylan was sitting very, very still. Little wonder that she wanted to avoid notice if this Tuan frightened Suroth, as she plainly did. "I am displeased, Suroth," the girl said again, sternly frowning down at the other woman. Even standing, she did not have all that far down to stare at the seated high lady. Matt supposed she must be a high lady too, only higher than Suroth. "You have recovered, and that will please the Empress. But your ill eastward was a disaster that has been repeated. And if the place of the city are safe, how can he have been set upon?" Suroth's knuckles were white from gripping the chair arm. Her wine cup. as though the lecture were her fault, and gave her an apologetic smile and bowed her head. Oh, blood and ashes, he was going to pay for that. I fell down, that's all. His voice might as well have been fireworks for the way heads whipped around. Suroth and Tuon looked shocked that he had spoken. Tylan looked like an eagle who wanted her rabbit fried. My ladies, he added, didn't prove anything. The tall woman suddenly reached out and snatched the wine cup from Tuon's hand, throwing it into the fire. Sparks showered up the chimney. The serving woman stirred as if to retrieve the cup before it could be damaged further, then subsided at a touch from the Sojin. You are being foolish, Tuon, the tall woman said, and her voice made the girl's sternness seem laughter. The too familiar Seanchan drawl seemed almost absent entirely. Suroth has the situation here well in her control. What happened to the East can happen in any battle. You must stop wasting time on ridiculous trifles. Suroth gaped at her.
How's your day been so far, Soy?
Assume a frozen mask. Matt did a little gaping on his own part. Use that tone of voice to one of the blood, and you were lucky to escape to the flogging post. Shockingly, Tuon inclined her head slightly. You may be right, Anath, she said calmly, and even with a touch of deference. Time and the omens will tell. But the young man plainly is lying. Perhaps he fears Tylan's anger. But his injuries are more than he could sustain, unless there are cliffs in the city I have not seen. So he feared Tylan's anger, did he? Well, come to that, he did, a little. Only a little, mind. But he did not like being reminded of it. Leaning on his shoulder-high staff, he tried to make himself comfortable. They could ask a man to sit, after all. I was hurt the day your lads took the city, he said with his cheekiest grin. Your lot were flinging around lightning and balls of fire, something fierce. I'm just about healed, though. Thank you for asking. Tylan buried her face in her wine cup and still made a look over the rim that promised retribution later. Tuon's skirts rustled as she crossed the carpets to him. The dark face behind that sheer veil might have been pretty without the expression of a judge passing sentence of death. And with a decent head of hair instead of a bald pate. Her eyes were large and liquid, but utterly impersonal. All of her long fingernails were lacquered, he noticed, a bright red. He wondered whether that signified anything. Why, a man could live in luxury for years on the price of those rubies. She reached up with one hand, putting her fingertips under his chin, and he started to jerk back, until Tylan glared at him over Tuon's head, promising retribution here and now if he did any such thing. Glowering, he let the girl shift his head for her study. You fought us, she demanded. You have sworn the oaths? I swore, he muttered. For the other, I had no chance. So you would have, she murmured. Circling him slowly, she continued her study, fingering the lace at his wrist, touching the black silk scarf tied around his neck, lifting the edge of his cloak to examine the embroidery. He endured it, refusing to shift his stance, glowering fit to match Tylan. Might he had bought horses without so thorough an examination. Next, she would want to look at his teeth. The boy told you how he was injured, Anath said in frosty tones of command. If you want him, then buy him and be done. The day has been long, and you should be in your bed. Tuon paused, examining the long signet ring on his finger. It had been carved as a tri-piece to show the carver's skills. A running fox and two ravens in flight, all surrounded by crescent moons, and he had bought it by chance, though he had come to like it. He wondered whether she wanted it. Straightening, she stared up at his face. Good advice, Anath, she said. How much for him, Tylan? If he is a favorite, name your price, and I will double it. Tylan choked on her wine and began coughing. Matt almost fell off his staff. The girl wanted to buy him? Well, she might as well have been looking at a horse for all the expression on her face. He is a free man, High Lady, Talon said unsteadily when she could speak. I cannot sell him. Matt could have laughed if Talon did not sound as though she were trying to keep her teeth from chattering, if Bloody Tuon had not just asked his price. A free man. Ha! The girl turned away from him as though dismissing him from her mind. You are afraid, Talon, and under the light you should not be. Gliding to Talon's chair, she lifted her veil with both hands, baring the lower half of her face, and bent to kiss Talon lightly, once on each eye and once on the lips. Talon looked astounded. You are a sister to me, and to Surath, Tuon said in a surprisingly gentle voice. I myself will write your name as one of the blood. You will be the High Lady Talon, Queen of Altara, and more, as was promised you. Anath snorted loudly. Yes, Anath, I know. The girl sighed, straightening and lowering her veil. The day has been long and arduous, and I am weary. But I will show Talon what lands are in mind for her, so she will know and be easy in her mind. There are maps in my chambers, Talon. You will honor me by accompanying me there? I have excellent masseuses. The honor is mine, Talon said, sounding not all that much steadier than before. At a gesture from the Sojin, the yellow-haired man went running to open the door and kneel holding it open, but there was still all the smoothing and adjusting of clothes that women had to do before they would go anywhere, Seanchan or Altaran, or from anywhere else, though the red-haired Dakavale performed the function for Tuon and Surath. Matt took the opportunity to draw Talon a little aside, far enough that he would not be overheard. The Sojin's blue eyes kept coming back to him, he realized, but at least Tuon, accepting the attentions of the slender Dakavale woman, seemed to have forgotten he existed. I didn't just fall down, he told Talon softly. The Golem tried to kill me not much more than an hour ago. It might be best if I left. The thing wants me, and it'll kill anybody near me, too. The plan had just occurred to him, but he thought it had a good chance of success. Talon sniffed. It cannot have you, Piglet. She directed a look at Tuon that might have made the girl forget about Talon being his sister had she seen. And neither can she. At least she had sense enough to whisper. Who is she? He asked. Well, it had never been more than a chance. The High Lady Tuon, and you know as much as I, Talon replied, just as quietly. Surath jumps when she speaks, and she jumps when Anath speaks, though I would almost swear that Anath is some sort of servant. They are a very peculiar people, sweetling. Suddenly she flaked some mud from his cheek with one finger. He had not realized he had mud on his face, too. Suddenly the eagle was strong in her eyes. Do you recall the pink ribbons, sweetling? When I come back, we'll see how you look in pink. She swanned out of the room with Tuon and Surath, trailed by Anath and the Sojin and the Dakavale, leaving Matt with the grandmotherly serving woman, who began to clean up the wine table. He sank into one of the bamboo-carved chairs and rested his head in his hands. Any other time, those pink ribbons would have had him gibbering. He never should have tried to get his own back with her. Even the Golem did not occupy much of his thoughts. The dice had stopped, and... what? He had come face to face, or near enough, with 3 people he had not met before, but that could not be it. Maybe it was something to do with Talon becoming one of the blood. But always before, when the dice stopped, something had happened to him personally. He sat there worrying over it while the serving woman called in others to carry everything away. Sat there until Tylin returned. She had not forgotten about the pink ribbons, and that made him forget about anything else for quite a long time. Chapter 18. An Offer. The days after the Golem tried to kill him settled into rhythms that irritated Mat no end. The gray sky never altered except to give rain or not. There was talk in the streets of a man being killed by a wolf not far outside the city, his throat ripped. No one was worried, just curious. Wolves had not been seen close to Abu Dar in years. Mat worried. City people might believe a wolf would come that close to city walls, but he knew better. The Golem had not gone away. Harnan and the other Red Arms stubbornly refused to leave, claiming they could watch his back, and Bannon refused without reasons, unless a muttered comment that Mat had a good eye for fast horses was supposed to be one. He spat after he said it, though. Rizal, her olive face pretty enough to make a man swallow, her big dark eyes knowing enough to dry his tongue, inquired about Ulver's age, and when he said close on 10, she looked surprised and tapped her full lips thoughtfully, but if she changed anything in the boy's lessons, he still came away from them bubbling equally over her bosom and the books she read in. Mat thought Ulver would almost have given up his nightly games of snakes and foxes for Rizal and the books. And when the lad ran out of the rooms that once had been Mat's, Tom often slipped in with his harp under his arm. By itself, that was enough to make Mat grind his teeth, only that was not the half. Tom and Beslin frequently went out together, not inviting him, and were gone for half the day or half the night. Neither would say a word more about their schemes, though Tom had the grace to look embarrassed. Mat hoped they were not going to get people killed for nothing, but they showed little interest in his opinions. Beslin glared at the very sight of him. Julian continued to slip above stairs and was seen by Suroth, which earned him a strapping hung up by his wrists from a stall post in the stables. Mat saw his welts tended by Bannon, the man claimed doctoring men was the same as doctoring horses, and warned him it could be worse next time, but the fool was back on the upper floors that very night, still wincing from the weight of his shirt on his back. It had to be a woman, though the thief-catcher refused to say. Mat suspected one of the Shon-Chen noblewomen. One of the palace servants could have met him in his own room, with Tom out of it so much. Not Suroth or Tuon, to be sure, but they were not the only Shon-Chen high blood in the palace. Most of the Shon-Chen nobles rented rooms, or more often whole houses in the city, but several had come with Suroth, and a handful with the girl, too. More than one of the women looked a pleasant armful in spite of their crested heads and their way of staring down their noses at everybody without shaved temples, if they noticed them more than they did the furniture, that was. If it seemed unlikely that one of those haughty women would look twice at a man who slept in the servants' quarters, well, the like new women had peculiar tastes in men. He had no choice but to leave Julian alone. Whoever the woman was, she might get the thief-catcher beheaded yet, but that sort of fever had to burn itself out before a man could think straight. Women did strange things to a man's head. The newly arrived ships disgorged people and animals and cargo for days on end, enough that the city's massive walls would have burst from the inside had they all stayed. But they flowed through the city and out into the countryside with their families and their crafts and their livestock, prepared to put down roots. Soldiers passed through in thousands, too. Well-ordered infantry and cavalry with the flair of veterans, moving north in bright-colored armor, and east across the river. Mat gave up trying to count them. Sometimes he saw strange creatures, though most of those were unloaded above the city to avoid the streets. Torm, like three-eyed, bronze-scaled cats the size of horses, sending most real horses around them into a frenzy just by their presence, and Korm, like hairy wingless birds as tall as a man, tall ears twitching constantly, and long beaks seeming to yearn for flesh to rend, and huge Sredit, with their long noses and longer tusks. Rakan and the larger Tow-Rakan flew from their landing site below the Rahad, huge lizards spreading wings like bats and carrying men on their backs. The names were easy enough to pick up. Any Shan soldier was eager to discuss the necessity of scouts unrocking and the abilities of Quorum at tracking, whether Sreddit were useful for more than moving heavy loads, and Torm too intelligent to trust. He learned a great deal of interest from men who wanted what most soldiers did, a drink and a woman and a bit of a gamble, not necessarily in any given order. Those soldiers were indeed veterans. Shan was an empire larger than all the nations between the Arth Ocean and the spine of the world, all under one empress, but with a history of almost constant rebellions and revolts that kept its soldiers' skills keen. The farmers would be harder to dig out. Not all the soldiers left, of course. A strong garrison remained, not only Shan but steel-veiled Terrabonner lances and Amadisian pikemen with their breastplates painted to resemble Shan armor. And Altarans, too, besides Thailand's house armsmen. According to the Shan, the Altarans from inland, with red slashes crisscrossing their breastplates, were Thailands as much as the fellows guarding the Tarasin Palace, which, strangely, did not seem to best please her. It did not please the fellows from inland very much either. They and the men in Mitsubar's green and white eyed each other like strange tomcats in a small room. There was plenty of glaring going on. Terrabonners at Amadisians, Amadisians at Altarans, and the other way around. Well-aged, long-standing animosities bubbling to the surface, but no one went further than shaken fists and a few curses. 500 men of the Death Watch guards had come off the ships and remained in Abu Dhar for some reason. The ordinary sort of crime expected in any large city had fallen off dramatically under the Shan, but the guards took to patrolling the streets as if they expected cutpurses, bully boys, and maybe fully armed bands of brigands to spring out of the pavement. The Altarans and the Amadisians and the Terrabonners kept their tempers reined in. No one but a fool argued with the Death Watch guards, not more than once. And another contingent of the guards had taken up residence in the city, too. 100 Ogier, of all things, in the red and black. Sometimes they patrolled with the others, and sometimes they wandered about with their long-handled axes on their shoulders. They were not at all like Matt's friend Loyal. Oh, they had the same wide noses and tufted ears and long eyebrows that drooped to their cheeks beside their eyes the size of teacups. But the gardeners looked at a man as though wondering whether he needed pruning of a few limbs. Nobody at all was fool enough to argue even once with the gardeners. Shan flowed out from Abu Dhar, and news flowed in. Even when they had to sleep in the attic, merchants preened in the common rooms of inns, smoking their pipes and telling what they knew that no one else did, so long as the telling did not affect their profits. The merchants' guards cared little for profits they would not share, and told everything, some of it true. Seamen spread tales for anyone who would buy a mug of ale, or better, hot-spiced wine. And when they had drunk enough, they talked even more, of ports they had visited, and events they had witnessed, and likely dreams they had had after the last time their heads were full of fumes. Still, it was clear the world outside Abu Dhar was seething like the Sea of Storms. Tales of Aiel looting and burning came from everywhere, and armies were on the move other than the Shan, armies in Tyr and Murundi, in Arad Daman and Andor, in Amadisia, which was not yet entirely under Shan control, and dozens of armed gatherings too small to be called armies in the heartland of Altara itself. Except for the men in Altara and Amadisia, no one really seemed sure who intended to fight whom, and there was some doubt about Altara. Altarans had a way of taking advantage of troubles to try paying off grievances against their neighbors. The news that shook the city most, though, was of Rand. Matt tried his best not to think of him, or Perrin, but avoiding those odd swirls of color in his head was difficult when the Dragon Reborn was on everyone's lips. The Dragon Reborn was dead, some claimed, murdered by Aes Sedai, by the whole White Tower descending on him at once in Cairhien. Or maybe it was in Ilion, or Tyr. No, they had kidnapped him. He was held prisoner in the White Tower. No, he had gone to the White Tower on his own and sworn fealty to the Amerlin seat. The last gained great credence because a number of men claimed to have seen a proclamation, signed by Elida herself, that announced it. Matt had his doubts about Rand being dead or swearing fealty, at least. For some odd reason, he felt sure he would know if Rand died. And as for the other, He did not believe the man would put himself within 100 miles of the White Tower voluntarily. Dragon Reborn or no Dragon Reborn, he had to have more sense than that. That news, all the versions of it, stirred the Seanchan the way a stick stirs an ant-heap. High-ranking officers strode the halls of the Tarasin Palace at every hour of the day and night, their odd-plumed helmets beneath their arms, their wings on the floor tiles, their faces set. Couriers raced away from Ebu Dar on horses and on Torakan. Suldam and Amani began patrolling the streets instead of just standing guard at the gates, once more hunting for women who could channel. Matt kept out of the officer's way and nodded politely to the Sultan in the streets. Whatever Rand's situation was, he could do nothing about it in Ebu Dar. First, he had to get out of the city. The morning after the Golem tried to kill him, Matt burned every last one of the long pink ribbons, the whole great wad of them, in the fireplace as soon as Tylan left her apartments. He also burned a pink coat she had had made for him, 2 pairs of pink breeches, and a pink cloak. A stench of burning wool and silk filled the rooms, and he opened some windows to let it out. But he did not really care. He felt a great relief dressing himself in bright blue breeches and embroidered green coat, and a blue cloak with painfully ornate working. Even all the lace did not bother him. At least none of it was pink. He never wanted to see anything that particular color ever again. Wrapping his hat on his head, he stumped out of the Tarasin Palace with a renewed determination to find that cubbyhole to store what he needed for his escape. If he had to visit every tavern, inn, and soldier's dive in the city 10 times over. Even those in the Rahad, 100 times. Gray gulls and black-winged skimmers swirled in leaden sky that promised more rain, and an icy wind carrying the tang of salt whipped across the Mulhara, flailing cloaks about. He thumped the paving stones as though intending to crack every one. Light, if need be, he would go with Luca in what he wore. Maybe Luca would let him work his way as a buffoon. The man would probably insist on it. At least that would keep him close to Aludra and her secrets. He stalked the whole width of the square before he realized that he was in front of a wide white building he knew well. The sign over the arched door proclaimed the Wandering Woman. A tall fellow in red and black armor strode out, 3 thin black plumes on the front of the helmet under his arm, and stood waiting for his horse to be brought around. A bluff-faced man with gray hair. Matt avoided looking at him. No matter how pleasant the man might appear on the surface, he was a Death Watch guard after all, and a banner general to boot. The Wandering Woman, so near the palace, had every room rented by high Seanchan officers. For that reason, he had not been back since he was able to walk again. Ordinary Seanchan soldiers were not such bad fellows, ready to gamble half the night and buy a round when it came their turn. But high-ranking officers might as well be nobles. Still, he had to start somewhere. The common room was almost as he remembered, high-ceilinged and well-lighted by lamps burning on all the walls, despite the early hour. Solid shutters covered the tall, arched windows now for warmth, and fires crackled in both long fireplaces. A faint haze of pipe smoke filled the air, and the smell of good cooking from the kitchens. 2 women with flutes and a fellow with a drum between his knees were playing a quick, shrill Ebu Dari tune that he nodded in time to. Not that from when he had stayed there, so far as it went. But all of the chairs held Seanchan now, some in armor, others in long, embroidered coats, drinking, talking, studying maps spread out on the tables. A graying woman with the flame of a bomb embroidered on her shoulder at one table, and at another a skinny round-faced Tamani at her heels appeared to be a number of the Seanchan had the sides and backs of their heads covered, so they seemed to be wearing bowls. Back left long in a sort of tail that hung to the shoulders on men and often to the waist on women. Those were simple lords and ladies, not high anything, but that hardly mattered. A lord was a lord, and besides, the men and women going to fetch a serving maid for more drinks had the smooth-cheeked, disdainful look of officers themselves, which meant the folk they were fetching for had rank to cause a man trouble. Several noticed him and frowned, and he almost laughed. Then he saw the innkeeper coming down the railless stairs. A stately hazel with large golden hoops in her ears, and a little gray in her hair. Setela Anan was not Ebudari, or even Altaran, he suspected, but she wore the marriage knife hanging hilt down her collar into a deep, narrow neckline, a long curved blade at her waist. She knew he was supposed to be a lord, but he was not sure how far she believed any longer, or what good it would do if she still swallowed the whole faradiddle. In any case, she looked at him at the same instant and smiled, a welcoming smile that made her face even prettier. There was nothing for it but to go and greet her and ask after her health, not too elaborately. Her muscular husband was a fishing boat captain with more dueling scars than Matt wanted to think about. Straight off, she wanted to know about Nynaeve and Elaine, and to his surprise, whether he knew anything about the kin. He had no idea she had even heard of them. They went with Nynaeve and Elaine, he whispered, cautiously keeping watch to make sure no Seanchan was paying them any mind. He did not intend to say too much. Talking about the kin where Seanchan might hear made the back of his neck prickle. So far as I know, they're all safe. Good. I would be pained had any of them been collared. The fool woman did not even lower her voice. Yes, that's good, he muttered, and hurriedly explained his needs before she could start shouting how happy she was that women who could channel had escaped the Seanchan. He was happy too, just not happy enough to put himself in chains for joy. Shaking her head, she seated herself on the steps and put her hands on her knees. Her dark green skirts, sewn up on the left side, showed red petticoats. Ebudari really did seem to knock tinkers on their heels when it came to choosing colors. The buzz of Seanchan voices fought with the high-pitched music all around them, and she sat there looking at him sternly. You don't know our ways. That is the trouble, she said. Pretties are an old and honored custom in Altara. Many a young man or woman has a final fling as a pretty, pampered and showered with presents, before settling down. But you see, a pretty leaves when she chooses. Tylan shouldn't be treating you as I hear she is. Still, she added judiciously, I must say she dresses you well. She made a circling motion with one hand. Hold out your cloak and turn around so I can get a better look. Matt drew a deep, calming breath. And then 3 more. The color flooding his face was sheer fury. He was not blushing. Certainly not. Like, did the whole city know? Do you have a space I can use or don't you? He demanded in a strangled voice. It turned out that she did. He could use a shelf in her cellar, which she said stayed dry year-round, and there was the small hollow under the kitchen's stone floor where he once had kept his chest of gold. It turned out the rental price was for him to hold out his cloak and turn around so she could get a better look. She grinned like a cat. One of the Seanchan, a buzzard-faced woman in red and blue armor, enjoyed the show so much that she tossed him a fat silver coin with strange markings, a forbidding woman's face on one side and some sort of heavy chair on the other. Still, he had his place to store clothes and money, and once he returned to the palace, to Tylan's apartments, he found out he had clothes to store in it. I fear my lord's garments are in a terrible state, Naram said lugubriously. The skinny, gray-haired Karienen would have been as dolorous announcing the gift of a sack of fire drops, though. His long face was perpetually in mourning. He did keep an eye on the door against Tylan's return, however. Everything is quite filthy, and I am afraid mildew has ruined several of my lord's best coats. They were all in a cupboard with Prince Beslin's childhood toys, my lord, Lupin laughed, tugging at the lapels of a dark coat like Julian's. The balding man was the reverse of Naram, stout instead of bony, dark instead of pale, his round belly always shaking with laughter. For a time, after Nelisian's death, it had seemed he intended to compete with Naram at sighing, the way they did over everything else, but the intervening weeks had recovered him to his normal self. As long as no one mentioned his former master, anyway.
They are dusty, though, my lord. I doubt anyone has been in that cupboard since the prince put his toy soldiers away.
Feeling that his luck was running strong at last, Matt told them to start taking his clothes across to the Wandering Woman, a few pieces at a time, and a pocket full of gold each trip. His black-hafted spear, propped in the corner of Tylen's bedchamber, with his unstrung Two Rivers bow, would have to wait for last. Getting that out might be as difficult as getting himself out. He could always make a new bow for himself, but he was not going to abandon the Arshandarai. I paid too high a price for the bloody thing to leave it, he thought, fingering the scar hidden beneath the scarf around his neck. One of the first among too many. Light, it would be nice to think that he had more to look forward to than scars and battles he did not want. And a wife he did not want or even know. There had to be more than that. First came getting out of Abu Dar with a whole hide, though. That above all else, first. Lopen and Narim bowed themselves out of his presence with the equivalent of 2 fat purses spread about their clothing, so as not to create any bulges. But no sooner had they gone than Tylen appeared, wanting to know why his body servants were running in the halls as though racing each other. If he had been feeling suicidal, he could have told her they were racing to see who would be first to reach the inn with his gold, or maybe just the first to start cleaning his clothes. Instead, he busied himself diverting her, and soon enough that chased any other thoughts out of his head, except for a glimmer that his luck had finally begun to pay off at something besides gambling. All it needed to put the cap on would be for Aludra to give him what he wanted before he left. Tylen put her mind to what she was doing, and for a time, he forgot fireworks and Aludra and escaping. For a time. After a little searching through the city, he finally located a bell founder. There were a number of gong makers in Abu Dar, but only one bell maker, the foundry outside the western wall. The bell maker, a cadaverous, impatient fellow, sweated in the heat of his huge iron furnace. The sweltering foundry's one long room might have been some sort of torture chamber. Hoisting chains dangled from the rafters, and sudden flames gouted from the furnace, throwing flickering shadows and leaving Matt half blind. And no sooner would he blink away the afterimage of a raging fire than another eruption would leave him squinting again. Workmen, dripping with sweat, poured molten bronze from the furnace's melting pot into a square mold, half again as tall as a man, that had been levered into position on rollers. Other great molds like it stood around the stone floor, amid a litter of smaller molds in various sizes.
My lord is pleased to jest.
Master Sutoma forced a chuckle, but he did not look amused, with his damp black hair hanging down and clinging to his face. His chuckle sounded as hollow as his cheeks, and he kept shooting frowns at his workmen, as though suspecting they would lie down and go to sleep if he did not maintain a close watch on them. A dead man could not have slept in that heat. Matt's shirt stuck to him damply, and he was beginning to sweat his coat through in patches.
I know nothing of illuminators, my lord, and I wish to know nothing. Useless fripperies, fireworks, not like bells. If my lord will excuse me, I am very busy. The High Lady Suroth has commissioned 13 bells for a victory set, the largest bells ever cast anywhere, and Calwyn Sutoma will cast them.
That it was a victory over his own city did not seem to bother Sutoma in the least. The last was enough to make him grin and rub his bony hands together. Matt attempted to make Aludra relent, but the woman might as well have been cast bronze herself. Well, she was considerably softer than bronze once she finally let him put an arm around her. Yet kisses that left her trembling did nothing to slacken her resolve. Me? I do not believe in telling a man more than he needs to know, she said breathlessly, sitting beside him on a padded bench in her wagon. She allowed no more than kisses, but she was very enthusiastic about those. The thin, beaded braids she had taken to wearing again were a tangle. Men gossip, yes? Chatter, chatter, chatter. And you yourselves don't know what you will say next. Besides, maybe I have made you the puzzle just to make you return, yes? And she set about further disarraying her hair, and his as well. She put up no more night flowers, though, after about the chapter house in Tonchito. He tried 2 more visits tonight.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call it an end to this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by and chill with me. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.